Good morning, everyone. Welcome to AstenJ Professional Training's webinar on conveyancing and property law. So thank you, everyone, for joining us on a Saturday morning. It's not always easy, I know, on a weekend morning to attend a day-long training. But we have two sessions today. So the first session will focus on conveyancing law updates, and that will start from 10 a.m. to 1:20. Now, there'll be some people who are registered for both sessions today, and those who are registered for the afternoon session will be treated to a session on commercial property, which will start from 2 p.m. and will go on till around 5:20 p.m. So if you have registered for both of these seminars, for both training sessions, you would have received two separate emails with two separate links to join each event. So you'll need to click them separately. So for those of you who are in the morning session, once this session on conveyancing law updates has finished, you'll then need to log out and log back in using the new link, which has been sent to you in a separate email. Just a bit of housekeeping before we start. If you have questions throughout the seminar, please post them in the chat box and not the Q&A box. So don't bother posting anything in the Q&A box. Keep everything in the chat box. And also keep questions short, please. Short, precise sort of questions would be much appreciated. So delivering both training sessions today, we have Mr. Richard Snape. He's been the head of professional support at David Jones Bold since 2002. He speaks at numerous courses for law societies all over the country, and speaks at various public courses, in-house seminars, and within solicitors' firms. And he's also talked extensively to local authorities and central government bodies. So we're all very fortunate to have him with us. So without further ado, Richard, I'll hand it over to you. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I'll tell you what we'll do. Please do ask questions throughout. I mean, it's a long day, as mentioned, on a Saturday as well. I'll probably finish the morning session soon after 1 o'clock, actually, because it's a long session on video conferences otherwise, and I will probably finish. Also, I think I probably need the best part of an hour by way of a break for lunch, and also I'll finish the afternoon soon after 5, if that's okay. But as was mentioned, do ask questions throughout this session, because it works a lot better if you're not just looking at and listening to me speaking for sort of 5.5 or whatever it might be hours. We'll also have a break mid-morning and mid-afternoon as well. Let's say I know some of you are not here this afternoon. We're still expecting a few more people, but it's gone 10:05 now. So I'll tell you what we'll do throughout. It is a conveyancing update during the course of the morning. The first few pages are leasehold, which, if I know you're probably from all over the place, looking and listening in, but large swathes of the country, you can't avoid leaseholds and flats at the moment, and London's been like that for many a year. The first few pages are basically post-Grenfell changes, and I'll start off with that. The worst part of all being these external wall system certificates, which I was mentioning around about Easter time when I last did a course for AstenJ. But things have moved on a pace, and they're causing absolute chaos in the world of conveyancing of flats, not just in relation to high-rise buildings. And I'll tell you the latest on that. They really need to start again. They need to just sort of rip up the EWS1 certificates and start afresh. I've just got a pop-up come on, so get rid of that. After that, although it's over a year since it changed last, you've got the TA6 4th edition version 2, briefly, the inquiries. And I wanted to use that as a way of talking around a couple of topics in particular, old favourites of mine, but the latest on Japanese knotweed and the latest on septic tanks as well. The TA6s, they desperately needed to change when they changed last year, but they need to change again, quite honestly. There's a few miscellaneous areas. You've got some of the new schemes like Help to Buy schemes, which are becoming incredibly common in the world of new builds. You've got something called first homes that just came in over the summer, and the new model shared ownership leases that the government's introduced. You've got a few things like planning permission changes, 1 or 2 cases. And in the latter part, I'll concentrate on, again, it's a favourite of mine. Some of you have certainly heard it from me before, but it's still causing absolute chaos. We desperately need some clarification. We need a case on it or legislation. And that's estate rent charges. The one area towards the very end of the morning where things have actually changed for the better, and the process have been changing for the better, are these escalating ground rents. We've got legislation going through Parliament as we speak. And we've also got a lot of the builders, the bigger builders, being pressurised by the Competition and Markets Authority into retrospectively getting rid of these sort of doubling ground rents and the likes. So there's a bright light in relation to that one, but please do ask questions throughout. As I've started off, I'll start off with the first page proper. You should have these notes, the conveyancing update notes. And the first page is in relation to building regs in Grenfell. As I mentioned, the first paragraph is not the really important bit, but I'll mention it. Back in 2016, the Welsh government, England and Wales, the conveyancing is getting very different nowadays. I do know increasing numbers of English conveyancers who won't touch conveyancing in Wales, in some parts of the country. You have to. I'm here in Cheshire, and in Cheshire being not that far from the one shares a border, you have to do it. But large parts of the country, I say people are just not doing conveyancing in Wales anymore. But the Welsh government had already introduced back in January of 2016 sprinkler requirements for sprinkler systems in dwellings generally. It came in England at the end of 2018, but only in relation to high-rise buildings, 30 metres or more in height, and it's not retrospective. 30 metres is give or take a story. It's about 10 stories. You must have sprinkler systems. But it's this next heading, which is the important thing, and the Building Amendment Regulations of 2018 came in on November the 28th. They only apply in England, at least in January 2020 for Wales, if you're interested, but they only apply if you laid your plans or you served an official notice or a building notice to the local authority before that date, it doesn't apply. But if you've got 2018 building regulations and you've seen it, it does apply, and there shouldn't be problems with combustible materials in the building because they've been banned. And as it says, it actually applies to mixed business residential properties, as long as it's got at least one dwelling. So all this, it is actually mentioned briefly in the afternoon, but I won't spend too long on it then. But it applies to mixed business residential properties, including things like student accommodation, care homes, sheltered housing, hospitals and the likes, not hotels or boarding houses, hostels. And it's not just the building itself that cannot, if it's got the relevant building regulations, have combustible material. It's also attachments to the buildings. Most notably, solar panels mustn't be dangerous in relation to fire safety. And the one they seem to be increasingly concerned with is balconies. Mustn't have combustible material like wood. So only 18 metres or more in height buildings. Should have made that clear a bit earlier on, which is give or take 6 stories. That sort of case that you can see a couple of years back now, crown on the application of the British Blind and Shutter Association and the Secretary of State. Do I not want to go to their Christmas party? The kind of people you might just be stuck sitting opposite on a long train journey, the British Blind and Shutter Association. I'm sure it's fascinating. But originally, external blinds and shutters and awnings and canopies came within the building regs till 2018. That was dropped because they can't make them non-combustible. Apparently, you can't make them completely non-combustible, and the government hadn't consulted with anybody unusually. And so that's not covered now. But if you've got 2018 building regs in England at least, then there shouldn't be a problem with combustible materials. A few of the mortgage companies, I know, for instance, Halifax and BM Solutions, Birmingham Midshires, are saying we won't need these EWS1 certificates if you've got 2018 building regulations, which is significant. So that's the first stage. Any questions on the chat facility on that? I'll mention the second page, if there's no questions on that, in the Fire Safety Act. I'll chat around this a bit, actually. It's received the royal assent. It was several months later than people thought it was going to be, but it received the royal assent on April the 29th this year. It's not in force in England yet. They're working on a lot of guidance. It's not a big piece of legislation. It's only 4 or 5 sections, but there's lots of guidance. It actually came into force in Wales on October the 1st, last Friday. So it can't be that, I did check yesterday, but it can't be that far away from coming into force in England. And keep your eyes open. The government says it just clarifies previous legislation, but it does a lot more than this. And if you do leasehold flats, regardless of the size, including mixed use, if it's got 2 or more dwellings, this is highly significant and you need to appreciate it. Basically, the background is that back in 2006, the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order came into force in October of that year of 2006. 2005 order, but was delayed for a year to come in. And it says that all commercial premises, all non-domestic premises have to have fire safety risk assessments. And it's a huge piece of regulation. There's lots of guidance. And buried amongst hundreds of pages, it says that includes the common parts of dwellings. As you'll appreciate, the non-domestic, the common parts of dwellings. So the commercial unit itself might need one, but the common parts of the dwellings must have one as well. And it's the person who is in control of the common parts who must have the risk assessment, and that's the landlord, almost certainly. So they must have one of these fire safety risk assessments for the common parts. And if it is mixed use commercial, the individual should have one for the unit. If you don't have a fire safety risk assessment, this is not dealt with in the 2021 Act, but if you don't have a fire safety risk assessment, it's a criminal offence. You can be prosecuted. People have been prosecuted. And you can understand why. It's unfortunate that it's usually after the event that the prosecutions occur. But more significantly, in terms of your job, or as significantly, you are in danger of vitiating your insurance, your buildings and contents insurance for the premises. I do know just after this all came in 2005-06, that various people, I know one of the local law societies, contacted some of the insurers, and in particular, Aviva, is when they were still Norwich Union, and also AXA. What would happen if you didn't have a fire safety risk assessment? And I know that Aviva said that if it was something like a masonette, crisscross as they call them, masonette, you just got a house converted into 2 flats or masonettes with a common porch, they would still pay out claims. But if it was anything other than that, anything more complicated than that, they would reserve the right to refuse claims. And if you haven't got insurance, you can't report to the mortgage company, everything's fine. I've seen some of the mortgagees basically saying that they'll expect someone to see a risk assessment if, even if it is a masonette with a common porch, it's not an elaborate one. But that's some of the background and to all this. I remember the first few years of this legislation being in force, and I remember telling people about this in 2007, 8, 9, 10, and so on. And people were saying to me that, it doesn't apply. I was trying to convince people it would apply to common parts of dwellings. It's common knowledge now. And chances are, much more so than in commercial units, the common parts of a block of flats will have a fire safety assessment, unless various long leaseholders are trying to do it all themselves and sacked any managing agents there might be. But it doesn't say in the original legislation what the common parts are. It's just sort of one throwaway line. And that's what the Fire Safety Act does when it comes into force. And so it can't be far away, but the common parts include the structure and exterior of the whole block, whenever there's at least 2 dwellings, again, mixed use, it'll apply the common parts, the structure and exterior. Any external doors and windows must be within the fire safety assessment, and any attachments to the exterior, like, again, basically balconies. I say that seems to be the big scare thing at the moment. Must all be in the fire safety assessment. And also any internal doors or windows that open into the common parts must be within the risk assessment. It's a sure bet that when this comes in, that I would say that the vast majority of fire safety assessments will be out of date, the ones you'll see. The leasehold flat management inquiries, the LPE ones, I've not seen whether they're changing or not, but they do need to change. I would not just, you've got questions already, have you got a fire safety assessment? Please provide the fire safety assessment. I would, when this comes into force, certainly, and again, it can't be far away, I'd want to see, I'd want to ask a question: does the fire safety assessment comply with the Fire Safety Act and the guidance? I think that changes leasehold conveyancing, flat conveyancing. Any questions about that? Do ask questions. Very important, that one. Okay, next one. The Building Safety Bill, 2021 to 22. National news story the day before it was introduced into Parliament. Ministry of Housing, or the Ministry for Levelling Up, as it's about to become, has a tendency to leak things a day before they're introduced into Parliament. Yes, the Ministry of Levelling Up, what is now the Ministry of Housing, when you people, I suspect, down south, for the most part, have to start giving us Northerners your money. The background, it was a draft bill last year. It's post-Grenfell legislation, but it's not just about fire safety, far from it. If you can't sleep at nights, this is the legislation for you. It is 216 pages long. It's 147 clauses and 9 schedules. And I can't pretend to have looked at every last page. Not even during the lockdowns was my life that sad. And most of it is just, the regulations can be produced for this and regulations can be produced for that. And it doesn't mean too much to conveyancers and property lawyers, quite honestly. But you do need to appreciate it. They're not expecting it to come into force for some parts of it another year, and some parts the best part of 2 years away. So keep your eyes open on that. And obviously things could change. It was introduced into Parliament in July, but there's a long way from being finalised. The second paragraph down basically says when it applies. It applies to high-risk residential buildings. And high risk is basically 18 metres or more in height, again, a bit like the building regs. 18 metres, again, being 6 stories, or if it's less than 18 metres, if it's got 7 or more stories, you'll also come within what's in the second paragraph. A word of warning: if you've got clients buying flats in 7 or more story blocks, which are less than 18 metres in height, do check their height, because if they're sort of above about 5'11", then they probably can't get in the flat. You're usually looking at 6 stories. And they'll sue you for not checking their height, no doubt. But anyway, such buildings will have an accountable person. They could have several accountable persons who are the people basically who are sort of, they're the ones who are in control of the various premises. You'll have a principal accountable person who would usually be the landlord of the block. But if you've got something like you often get, especially in sort of mixed business residential properties, you'll have an intermediate landlord and then a head landlord. They'll both be accountable persons. And if you ever come across right to manage companies where the tenants have taken over the management, they the right to manage company would be an accountable person. There are criminal offences attached to this, fines and prosecutions and things. I would not want to be a member of a right to manage company if this was in place, because of the potential liability involved. The accountable person, or the principal accountable person, if there's more than one, has to appoint a building safety manager who's going to be answerable to something called the building safety regulator, which is part of the health and safety executive. The building safety manager, bear with me, will have to have a specific qualification. This is why it's probably not going to be until 2 years before it comes in, and will have to have insurance. And they will listen to complaints by any of the tenants about health and safety, not just fire safety, but anything. There's sort of dangerous balcony, there's sort of asbestos in the premises, whatever it might be. The cladding is not combustible, it's quite safe in relation to fire, but it's in danger of falling off, that kind of thing, anything to do with health and safety. And we'll have to basically tell the accountable person to do something about it where appropriate. They're not going to come cheap, these building safety managers. When this, a year ago, when they were talking about this legislation before it was introduced into Parliament, the government was saying the cost of this would not get added to service charge. The cost of this and any work that was required couldn't be added to service charge. If you look buried in the legislation, it could change, who knows, but there's something called a building safety charge. You can add the cost of the building safety managers, sort of fee, and also the cost of the any work to be done to a building safety charge, and charge the long leaseholders. And that's the case even if it's not covered by service charge. It's not the same thing, but the occupiers will be responsible. I should have perhaps mentioned before on the previous page, the Fire Safety Act. When the Fire Safety Act was going through Parliament, it was delayed, amongst other reasons, because the House of Lords was trying to amend it so that you couldn't add the cost of the fire safety assessment and any work to be done to the service charge, but the Commons threw that out. You get into a stage now where, especially in high-rise buildings, but not uniquely, the service charge liability and the liability in relation to these premises is going to go through the roof. I'm not sure I'd want to buy a flat in a high-rise building with the kind of fees that might be there, to make the property safe, completely and utterly safe. I've come across, you can understand why, but I was going to come back to it shortly. And again, please ask questions. But these EWS1s, these external wall systems, I came across one in Manchester, a place called Connect House. Manchester's got more problems with combustible cladding than anywhere per capita, much more than even London, which has got its fair share because Manchester's undergone so much development this last 20 years. And I know it well because I'm here, I've probably mentioned to some before, I'm here talking to you on a rather gloomy day in my house, my home in Cheshire. People ask me why I moved to Cheshire. I moved to Cheshire from the West Country about 3.5 years ago. And the reason why is because I'd seen a few episodes of The Real Housewives of Cheshire and thought that was the life for me. And I've not been disappointed, but there you go. But no, this one in Manchester, Connect House, I saw, it was late last year, probably. It's just a mid-2000s, 2005-6 build, ordinary flats in this block in the Chinese Quarter in Manchester. And they got service charge bills to remove cladding. The biggest per flat was almost £140,000 just to remove the combustible cladding and replace it. That's per flat, not for the whole building, but just for that one flat. And you add the cost of all these various things. I've seen £180,000 for removal of cladding, elsewhere in the country. And I'm sure there's higher still. Make sure that your client is aware that service charges can fluctuate massively whenever you're acting on a flat. Make sure you've told them and you can prove that you've told them that service charges can fluctuate wildly. Any comments so far? Keep your eyes open on that. I'll mention the other two paragraphs, which are not just around high-rise buildings. This is in all dwellings. This, I suspect, will come into force earlier. Perhaps more for the litigators, but than the conveyancers, but I'll tell you about it. They are now finding, apparently, that a lot of new build dwellings have been badly constructed. This was a shock to me, but have been badly constructed. And that thing in the third paragraph of page 3, section 1, subsection 6 of the Defective Premises Act, says you can only bring action in relation to a defective property within 6 years of becoming aware of the defect. So if you've got defects, it is from becoming aware of it. A lot of defects don't actually materialize until 5, 6, 7, 8 years later. But you've got to bring action within 6 years of becoming aware. There'd been another Manchester case, Sports City and Countryside, last year, where Sports City is a big development of flats in Manchester, about 350 flats. And they'd found that the cladding wasn't dangerous. Not all cladding by any means is combustible, but the cladding was falling off these blocks of flats. And the builders, Countryside, remedied the defects within 6 years of them becoming aware. But the owners becoming aware, the long leaseholders. But the remedial work needed to be remedied itself beyond the 6-year period. And the court decided you can't bring an action because you've waited too long. If you have to remedy the remedial work beyond 6 years, then it's fallen foul of the Defective Premises Act. So when this comes in, you'll be able to bring action within 15 years, and the government says unless it's within human rights legislation, that will be retrospective. So I've mentioned, supposing this comes into force next year, which I suspect it will do, and you became aware of the defect in 2010, you've got until 15 years hence, 2025, to bring action against the builder. And somebody needs to tell the government that the builder will almost certainly have gone into liquidation by then and won't be worth suing. Because even the bigger builders set up their own companies just for that development. And when the development's over, they wind up the company and they won't be there. So it's not going to be as sort of effective as you might think. Also, they say it's subject to human rights, I suspect, because they are preparing themselves for human rights claims by these people. By the builders. You can't make us retrospectively liable for something that's a breach of our human rights. The last few lines of that page, we've got a few cases on service charge liability towards the end of the morning. See how time permits us. So we'll tie things up around about 1 o'clock-ish, probably just after. But they also say in this legislation, and this part will probably come in next year, that you won't be able to add the cost of work to service charge unless you first pursue any new build guarantee that there might be, so the NHBC or whatever it might be. And only if they don't pay out after you've pursued them can you charge to the service charge. There was a case, Avon Ground Rents in Cowley a couple of years ago that says that's the case anyway, because the service charge must be reasonably incurred of a reasonable standard. And it's not reasonably incurred unless you pursue the new build guarantee first. So that's going to be all but worthless. No questions so far. Make sure clients are aware of what the service charge is. That's the really important message. The page 4 and 5, as I have mentioned to some in the past, but it's the biggest topic in certainly leasehold conveyancing at the moment, and it's causing absolute chaos. It's not legislation, and again, please do ask about this. It's not legislation, but I'm sure some of you who are looking and listening in, I've got a Q&A something. So try and use the chat facility. Yeah, we've got a question. What human right can a limited company assert under the Human Rights Act? I suspect it's more likely to be sort of things like directors of the company and the likes, or obviously when the circumstances, but there must be a reason, or independent contractors and the likes, but a limited company potentially couldn't come in, because that's a very good question. Can you use I always miss the Q&A. My mind is not what it used to be, and I can't multitask and look at the chat, the Q&A, and talk at the same time. So if you can use the chat, that'd be much, much better. Yeah, I mean, that's obviously why they've included a bit about human rights, and that's also I've seen within the commentaries and the likes. Again, so okay, right. I say this is the most significant thing. I was mentioning it when I did a course back in April for AstenJ, but not when I last did face-to-face talks before the first lockdowns and the likes, because no one had heard about them when I was last doing face-to-face talks. I think I was due to do a face-to-face talk just as the first lockdown started, but I haven't done an AstenJ sort of in London I haven't been to London since February of last year. But anyway, they, on page 4, the background is that one of the problems is this is not legislation, and we desperately just need to start again. It's causing absolute chaos. And I'm sure that people who are looking and listening in have had issues with this. Grenfell was in June of 2017. And after Grenfell, well, mortgage companies were doing different things. Valuers were doing different things in relation to fire safety and combustible cladding, not just aluminium composite material, which is what caused the Grenfell fire to spread so rapidly, but other kinds of metallic cladding as well. And if there was cladding on the premises, combustible cladding potentially on the premises, valuers were just valuing properties at zero, so you obviously couldn't get a mortgage. A zero valuation doesn't mean to say it's worthless. It means that we haven't got the information. We need to find out whether there's combustible cladding or not. We don't know. But obviously, different valuers were doing different things. There was no standardization between mortgage companies. So in late 2019, seems like a lifetime ago now, the mortgage companies got together with the UK Finance and the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors, but also the Building Society Association, which manages, if you like, some of the a lot of the smaller building societies. And they produced these EWS1 external wall system certificates. If the valuer basically told the mortgage company, we don't know whether there's combustible cladding, there's some kind of cladding, we don't want to know what it is, the mortgage company would want one of these EWS1 certificates. Originally, it was meant to be for 18 meters or more in height buildings. Again, give or take 6 stories if you sort of want a sort of rough estimate of what that's likely to be, but more of that shortly. They'd last 5 years with these EWS1 certificates, which isn't a problem yet, but unless things get sorted out, and I hope they will, it will be a problem in the future. Now, the first problem is that, well, the person who has to commission the certificates is not the mortgage company, it would be the landlord or the agents of that block. And they would commission these certificates. Sometimes you got landlords basically saying, we don't think it applies, and therefore we're not going to commission a certificate. And also the cost of the certificates, let alone any work that needs to be done, gets added to service charge almost certainly. You could charge for good estate management and modern service charges. Sometimes it can be, just a drive-by. It's glass, it hasn't got any cladding whatsoever. That's not a problem. But where there was cladding, I've seen a starting point for the cost would be about £6,000 just for the certificate, which get, for the whole block. It's on a building by building basis at least. And I've seen upwards of £50,000 for the certificate itself. Well, the bigger problem with that is that originally the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors was saying there's 21 different qualifications for people who can do these things. But, well, none of them could get insurance. I know of a couple of surveyors who, chartered surveyors who wanted to do these things, and they contacted their public liability insurance, to be told that we're not going to insure you because the amount of risk involved and the claim involved if you got it wrong would be so great. So they had to be fire safety inspectors. Not much more than a year ago, in the summer of last year, there was only about 290 qualified people who had insurance to do them. The government's now backed up its own insurance so people can do them, and there's more people being trained up, but there's still not enough. I'll give a word of warning to you. There's a lot of people, by all accounts, we don't know how many, who are doing these EWS1 certificates without any qualification and no insurance. And there are prosecutions pending under the Fraud Act. You shouldn't have been doing these things. Again, spring of last year, the average wait, it's got better, but the average wait to get somebody around, it's upwards of 3 million flats, albeit on a building by building basis. The average wait was 42 months. I say it has got better. It's not in the notes, this, but it occurs to me that you might want to know. There is something called the Building Safety Information Portal, which is set up by a body called the Fire Safety Association. Again, I don't want to go to their Christmas party either. Admirable thing, but not sure. But the Building Safety Information Portal, you just go online, and I'm not vouching for it or anything like that, but apparently, well, just because the EWS1 is not, on the portal, it's not being downloaded onto this portal, doesn't mean to say it's a bit dubious, but you can guarantee it's satisfactory if it's on the portal. I know recently HSBC have been saying that we'll pay for 6,000 of these EWS1 certificates to put on this portal, and we'll pay for it. It's a gesture of goodwill. So it's got to be pretty legitimate. But I say that's one of the problems. You're wondering how I know so much about the figures and things like this, I can tell. Well, here's the thing. I was chatting to the Master of the Rolls about this. Now you're impressed. If you do, if you know the Master of the Rolls. No, I'm sort of, the previous one, he's retired now, Sir Terence Etherton, or my friend Terry, as I like to call him, or Tell. But no, they had a debate in the House of Lords about it back at the end of June. And I was asked for a bit of input about it for some reason. So that's it. That's the kind of people I'm hanging around with now. But anyway, no, I'm not. Things got even worse in January of last year. So these things came in at early December. And then in January, the Ministry of Housing, soon to become the Ministry of Levelling Up Housing and Communities, produced this advice for building owners of multi-storey, multi-occupied residential buildings, which is mentioned in the third paragraph of page 4. And they must have known the chaos they would cause. Bear in mind, it was originally meant for 18 metres or more in height. This said that they might be required for less than 18 metres. In height buildings. They might be required for sort of, 3, 4, 5, or even 2-storey blocks of flats. We're not talking about high-rise blocks anymore. Not that 6 stories is a high-rise block. In some parts that you cannot avoid this in conveyancing unless you're lucky enough not to do any leasehold. And it might also apply to buildings that didn't have external cladding. And I then started to see, by about March of last year, we'll hear stories of people, mortgage companies requiring these EWS1 certificates for 3 or 4-storey brick facaded buildings, because behind the brickwork is potential cladding. This was news to me, but they put the cladding and they put a brick facade. The cladding was there for energy efficiency. So they started to require them for buildings that you wouldn't have even dreamt of requiring it. And they also were worried about something called high pressure laminate, which is nothing to do with metallic or aluminium cladding. If you know what you're looking for, high pressure laminate is all over the place. And apparently it's, it's layer after layer after layer of material. And if it's being produced correctly, it's completely safe in relation to fire resistance. But the estimate is that 80% has not been built, produced correctly, manufactured correctly. There was a fight, there had been a bit concerned about it beforehand, but in November of 2019, it was actually in the news, national news story, but not a huge one. There was a fire in some student halls of residence in Bolton, in Greater Manchester. And no one was injured, so it didn't cause anything near the publicity, obviously, of Grenfell. But it seemed that the fire had spread rapidly because of these gaps in the high pressure laminate. Sort of the air just, the oxygen just, ignites and the likes. But and so high pressure laminate suddenly became something that required these EWS ones. Then it was balconies. Balcony we'll come back to if there are balconies on the premises. And then the other thing that's been happening is that when they inspect these buildings, they then find that there are other defects. What you're supposed to do with these EWS ones is the person doing the certificate is supposed to grade it. Don't ask me about the details. If it's AE1, it's perfectly safe. If it's AE2, it's might see some kind of treatment. If it's lower than that, it needs to be replaced and the likes. But I've seen things that pass. The cladding is not combustible. But whilst they were inspecting the premises, they found that there was no fire breaks. There's no sort of fire retardant fire breaks that should have been built when the block was built. It's been built without them. And you've got to say, you wonder what building control's been doing. These are properties that had building regs and completion certificates at the time. I've mentioned again, first page of the notes, and 2000, and if you've got in England 2018 building regulations, then there should not be combustible materials. And so you should be okay in relation to not requiring an EWS1. Having said that, I have seen a mortgage company require an EWS1 on a new build with 2018 building regs. I've seen them refuse mortgages on one that passed, a block that passed, it didn't have combustible cladding. I've seen one where the surveyors told the mortgage company that there was no combustible cladding in this residential block, but next door there was a commercial premises with cladding, with combustible cladding, and they withdrew the mortgage. And there's a lot of people desperately trying to move at the moment from their flats. There's a lot of people, because of what's happened this last year and a half, they've been stuck in some big city, London included, living in their little flat, and they are desperate to move. It wasn't just the SDLT holiday, which is obviously now over. It was causing the property market to be dangerously overheating. It's what they call the race for space. I need a garden, and I didn't have a garden in the past. And I was talking to a friend of mine in Devon about it. She's as busy as ever. Continuing for a year and a half now. Because you've got people from the big cities, people from London thinking to themselves, I'd quite like to move to Devon and perhaps work from home remotely and go into London once a week or whatever on the train. And lots of people can't do that because purchasers can't get mortgages. And even if there isn't a mortgage company involved, to some extent, the cash buyers are the worst, because do you want to advise somebody to buy a flat and then find that they've got £140,000 service charge bill next year? And they say, make sure you do mention that service charges can be fluctuate wildly. Any comments before I look at newer things that have subsequently happened to these things? Nobody? Anybody had any experience of these things yet? I'm sure you have. The bottom part of page 4, the bottom sort of third to a quarter, well, the last little bit actually, the last two paragraphs, really, I suppose. November the 22nd last year, I remember it was a Sunday, again, the Ministry of Housing just, basically said this on a Sunday. It's a good time to make announcements. And it was on the news that very day, this has been a national news story. It's a bit of a national scandal, if truth be known. And the Ministry of Housing announced that we've had a word with the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors and UK Finance, the CML, as they always will be for me. And they have agreed that only in rare circumstances will you need these EWS1 certificates for less than 80 metres and high buildings. So the exceptions being things like care homes and the likes. About 2 days later that week, the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors said we haven't agreed anything. And by the end of that week, the mortgage companies would basically say, no one's told us about this. And it changed absolutely nothing. In March, the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors announced that they've reached new guidance. They've produced new guidance, and the valuers are going to be well, they don't have to, but they tend to follow what the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors tells them to do. Officially came in April, but if you go to page 5, I've mentioned, sort of paraphrase of what the guidance says. And if you want to try and persuade a mortgage company that we don't want one of these things, we don't need to wait around and pay for these things, those 3 bullet points are it. The government is saying that this has reduced the number of properties that will need cladding. I've got a question that's come up. I'll answer this, when I've just gone through this bit. But it'll reduce the number of people who need cladding, need EWS1 certificates by about 500,000. I am not sure how that's the case. If you've got more than 6 stories, then wherever there's cladding or curtain wall glazing, don't ask what that is, of any sort of cladding, then you'll need an EWS1, not just combustible cladding. Or if there are balconies that stack on top of one another, if they're made of combustible material, such as timber, or where there's decking which is constructed of combustible material, you'll need one of these things. And if there's 5 or 6 stories, so suddenly we're talking about 5-story buildings, huge numbers of them. If a quarter of the exterior of the building has got any kind of cladding, or there's any combustible cladding, or this high pressure laminate, or if they've got balconies that stack on top of one another made of combustible material like timber, wood, you'll need one of these things. And then officially, if there's less than 5 stories, you'll need it if there's combustible cladding, aluminium cladding, metallic cladding, or high pressure laminate. So suddenly we're talking about large numbers of 3, 4-story, 5-story buildings. And I can't think it would change anything. I'll say, I've got a question. I'll tell you what's been happening more recently. But I can't give real life situations. I can't answer real life situations. But if it was a hypothetical situation, the problem is that you've got a question about, don't rely on this recorded, but if it was hypothetical, you're asking that landlords are seeking funding to repair, so you can't get an EWS1. You're completely at the whim of the mortgage company. And if the mortgage company can't be persuaded otherwise, that's it. There was a building safety fund, which it's mentioned in the notes, which they came to an end at the end of June. The government said they'd pay for the replacement of any aluminium cladding, and they set aside 5 billion for other kinds of combustible cladding to be replaced only in 18 metre high buildings or more, but public and private sector. But you had to do things like exhaust other funding. They're talking about resurrecting the building safety fund, but you had to exhaust other funding, like if you got a new build guarantee. And by the time you'd applied to NHBC, and NHBC had come back, the June the 30th deadline had gone. And I did see figures that only 22% of people who applied for the Building Safety Fund actually got the money. So I just got a pop-up again. So you're at one company, unfortunately, in relation to these things. And if they can't, I did see one where they were persuaded otherwise, but I suspect you're going to have to wait until the cladding's been. But I did see the one kind of properties that are falling in price, flats with cladding. They Help to Buy and Homes England are saying they're losing lots of money on flats that had these equity loans, these Help to Buy equity loans. They're losing money because they get sold with a loss, and when you have to pay off the equity loan. If prices go up, you pay up pro rata with the increase, but prices are falling. There's also a Waking Watch fund, which they've still got money for, but officially ended in June. Because the other thing is that you have to pay, the government's, the fire authorities say that you have to pay for these waking watches until the cladding's replaced. You have to employ fire wardens to patrol up and down 24 hours a day and do things like knock on people's doors at dead of night and then run off, or that could be kids actually. The average waking watch is costing 11,000. There was a Waking Watch fund whereby you could apply to pay for smoke detectors and these kind of things, but it's run its course. How much responsibility have the local authorities taken for the building regulations overseeing the cladding mess? I've not seen anything. The problem is that you don't have, the purchasers wouldn't have a claim normally against the local authority for building regs. You might remember from your degree level studies and taught and the likes, it's all that sort of Anne's in London Borough of Merton, Murphy and Brentwood. You don't have a contract with the local authority, so you can't sue them for lack of, for problems in relation to building regs. Murphy and Brentwood, they built a house on a raft, which was inadequate, and the plans were inadequate, and building control hadn't spotted it. And the house starts to sink into Essex at a pace. And they tried to sue the local authority, and they couldn't, because you haven't got a contract. The tort action's not based on a contract, and it's pure economic loss. Your building is not worth what it should be worth. If things start to fall off and the likes and hurt people, then you might have a claim, but it's pure economic loss, so you can't claim in tort. That's the problem amongst others, but you do wonder what was happening in building control if they failed to spot things like fire breaks. I think it's an almighty mess. I don't know if anybody else has got any questions. The second note, the last thing on this, unless you've got questions, it is one to ask questions on, because again, it would be pure economic loss, so you couldn't probably claim in breach of statutory duty. It's literally Murphy and Brentwood, which was a House of Lords case in the late 80s. You don't have a claim against the local authority for failing to spot the plans and likes are inadequate. The other thing is that if you've got clients who've suffered from this, I know there are 7 blocks in this country where NHBC are paying for the removal of the cladding, but they won't tell us where the blocks are. But you're the whim of the mortgage company. The second to last note on page 5, in July, the Ministry of Housing announced that they've been discussing this with the mortgage companies, and some of the big mortgage companies and some of the smaller ones, the big ones including HSBC and Barclays and Lloyds Group, encompass a lot of mortgage companies, biggest lender of the lot. And they won't require these things for 18 meters or less in height. It took hours, literally hours, for the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors to say we haven't agreed anything. And the mortgage companies, likewise, a day or two later. The mortgage companies, for the most part, are saying that we'll be guided by our valuers. And unless the government withdraws its guidance in January 2020, then they'll still require them for buildings of less than 18 metres. They really desperately just tear this up and start again. You can see why it's there, but they need legislation. And if it was legislation that said it's only for 18 metres, it's only for 18 metres. Yeah. But it's the biggest mess. It's probably the biggest mess of anything I've ever come across in the whole of conveyancing, certainly leasehold. No final questions? Well, it didn't seem impressed by my discussing this with the Master of the Rolls, I must say. If you employ a private building regulation inspector who you've got a contract with, they would be contractually liable, yeah. I say the other thing is that how many of these EWS1 certificates are done fraudulently is a bit of a worry. We'll move on to happier things now, I think. Last time I was mentioning some of this, but I did want to mention this in a way of saving time. It's not so new nowadays, but the residential inquiries, the TA6s. The TA6s, standard and domestic conveyances you get, desperately, 2 years ago, they desperately needed to be updated. The third edition was getting to be very, very dated. In February of last year, again, with everything that's happened since seems a lifetime ago, they were updated. We had the fourth edition. I thought the changes were woeful, especially in one area, which if you're in central London is not big law, but you don't have to get too far outside to have problems with that septic tanks. You got a bit about this on the last page or two of these notes, but I'm not going to revisit some of this. But the first bullet point, the changes, the changes were so woeful, they changed again in July, the version 2 of the fourth edition. The first change was about Japanese knotweed. I don't know why there's this obsession with Japanese knotweed. I didn't do law to spot types of plant life, pond life possibly, but not plant life. I'm not sure why it's become a lawyer's job, both in the residential inquiries and the commercial property standard inquiries. And the other thing, again, there's a page on this towards the end, which I'll do no more than just draw attention to. There's more detail. The pendulum swung the other way for Japanese knotweed. They're now sort of saying it's not as the danger people were saying it was, a few years ago. There's been Japanese knotweed in this country since the 1830s, in late Georgian times, pre-Victorian times, since the early 1830s. It came into the country via Swansea, so many things do, and it was an ornamental plant, but then it was planted deliberately to stop landslips on riversides and canal sides and railway embankments. And it's very invasive. The consensus now is it doesn't break through foundations, as we were told a few years back, unless they're dodgy foundations. And it's not as dangerous as bamboo. I have missed traveling the country. I've done 7 face-to-face talks since the end of July now. And I've got another one next week. So they're slowly coming back. But I have missed traveling on trains throughout the country, looking at the Japanese knotweed. Getting the train into Manchester from here was wonderful. You could see it all Stockport. You could, just nip out at the station, get some knotweed. Right into the centre of Manchester with residential houses backing onto it. You can see it as I go into the train into Euston. You can see Japanese knotweed with residential properties, bits of backyard and things backing onto the railway embankments. I think they've treated a lot of it, but it's, if you get the train out of London down to the south coast, out of Victoria, you can see miles of knotweed. It was all over the site for the London Olympics, out of Liverpool Street and the likes, but they had to treat all that before the well, for the Olympics, it would be a disaster if back in 2012, Usain Bolt was to trip on some knotweed that's come up through the track overnight. But it's not as dangerous as people once thought. It's just that this last 15 years, it seems to have been, suddenly became the big scare story. I remember when I was a kid in Stoke-on-Trent, if you know Stoke-on-Trent, lots of derelict land there. And we used to play on the knotweed because it gets about 6 foot height, until it goes dormant under ground level. We used to play in the knotweed. You could sort of hide from other kids and strip off the leaves of the knotweed, and you just got a quite flexible sort of stem. And then you'd wait for another kid to come cycling by and then hit him with knotweed. Great fun. This was before the internet, when we had to make our own entertainment in those days. I have to say, a kid from Stoke-on-Trent meeting the master of the rolls one day, who would have thought it? I'll stop now. But anyway, for whatever reason, some years ago, the mortgage companies started to be very jittery about knotweed. Mortgage companies will now lend if there's knotweed, if you get a management plan saying it can be controlled before it gets to the foundations. There's also Japanese knotweed gin available. I've got some here actually at times. It's just gone 11, it's time to start. It isn't gin. There's a Japanese knotweed restaurant in Bristol and Brighton where you can take a loved one and have a Japanese knotweed based meal. You want to never see them again. But anyway, you've got questions about Japanese knotweed, and it says, is the property affected by knotweed? Yes, no, don't know, or not know. And somewhere, every day, at any moment in the day, somewhere as we speak, somebody is ticking the no box for that TA6 inquiry. You've got similar in the CPSC, not the same wording. And if the property is affected by knotweed, they could have a big claim against them for misrepresentation, especially in high value parts of the country like the Southeast. They could have a huge claim based on a percentage of the value, regardless of any damage it might be or not be doing. And the guidance to the residential inquiries was changed as a consequence last year. And it says that you should be ticking don't know if you're not sure. If they've got a management plan and they're treating the knotweed, they should be ticking yes, but the vast majority of people should be ticking don't know. They also make clear that, come the first frosts, it's dormant beneath ground level. You wouldn't see it even if you know what you're looking for. It's just dead wood. And also they make clear that Japanese knotweed, it could be affected by knotweed if it's next door. They say in the guidance within 3 meters of the boundary. Some surveyors say 7 meters. And say the pendulum swinging against knotweed being this huge danger now. But let's say within 3 meters of the boundary. I would make sure clients don't tick no to that question unless they are absolutely certain. I'd make clear to them. Most firms don't send the guidance to the clients, or at best they send a link and that's it. And most clients, I don't know how 18, 19 pages of TA6 is nowadays, and 18 pages of guidance notes, how to fill it in. You've got all these sort of web links, you can go and have a look what knotweed looks like. You can go and have a look if your conservatory needs building regulations. And most people just are not going to read that. The kind of people who read that are the troublemakers who pester you all the time, unfortunately. The people who sort of email you and then phone you 5 minutes later to see why you haven't replied. School teachers, people like that. But anyway, make sure your clients are ticking no. The other thing I'll mention, and again, it's the last page of these notes, but I won't go back to it, say just showing you where it is. In this particular, I think they've still got this wrong. I admit that a lot of you will rarely come across these if you're in the middle of urban areas doing most of your work, but you do come across an amazing number of properties that are not on the mains sewers. including my place here and all the other places around about where I am in Cheshire here. And, you know, you come across septic tanks in Surrey within less than 20 miles of London and likes. So they're much more commonplace out there than some people give them credit for. When I was last doing face-to-face talks, you know, for AstenJ, I was mentioning this because the law was due to change, or was in the process of changing. It's something called the General Binding Rules, and again, it's on the last page of the notes. If you've got a septic tank, as opposed to a treatment plant, these small treatment plants, clogesters being the brand name, or a cesspit, which stores and doesn't go into the environment if it's working. Well, these treatment plants, these clogesters, the water is supposed to be so pure when it comes out, you can drink it. And so that's what I've got out in the garden there. And this is some of the stuff here. I poured some before I started. Very nice. Got a sort of minerally taste to it, but not bad. Then in those circumstances, if that septic tank goes into a water course, as opposed to a drainage field, these fan systems underground. Well, what we thought when I was last down in London talking for AstenJ is that you had to replace it when you sold, you know, the conveyance. And the plan was that by January the 1st, 2020, regardless of a sale, you should replace it. That's what the Environment Agency was saying. You could be fined if you didn't. In November of 2019, they produced new guidance. And the Environment Agency, this is only England, not Wales, if you're interested. And the new guidance didn't mention 2020. Very good. I'm not going to read that out. You can read it yourselves. But anyway, don't put me off. But you had to replace these things by January the 1st, 2020. The new guidance said that, well, didn't mention 2020, it just said you have to replace as soon as reasonably practicable. I think they probably realized the vast majority of people didn't know about this, let alone having done it. So you don't have to delay the conveyancing process. The TA6s asked when, you know, the first 4th edition version 1 asked when the tank was last replaced or upgraded. That doesn't tell you anything. So they changed again last June of last year, I should say. And the new version basically says that if you've got a septic tank that drains into a watercourse, as opposed to its property on the main sewer, or a drainage field or a small treatment plant, then you need to replace it as soon as reasonably practicable, e.g. within a year. Fair enough, they should be replacing it within a year. What they didn't deal with, and I think I'd have to add this if you come across something that's not on the main sewer, is the fact that your average client doesn't have a clue what they've got if they're not on the main sewer. It's easy enough to find out whether you're on the main sewer by your utility bills. If they've had this tank maintained and they've got the records, that should tell you. Most people won't have that. I would actually ask the question, you know, if it's not on the main sewers, have you got a septic tank? Have you got a cesspit? Have you got a treatment plant? And if you've got a septic tank, does it drain into a watercourse? Or does it drain into a drainage field? And if they don't know, I'd want somebody to pay for a specialist drainage report. And who that is depends on what you've said in the contract. I'd make sure it's in the contract. I've seen replacement cost £8,000 plus VAT, and I've seen 50,000 plus VAT. Yeah. You need to deal with that in the contract and, you know, decide between buyer and seller who pays for it. Have you got any questions on that? When I used to live down in the West Country, it was in Bristol, then Bath, then if you went to the Mendips, you know, northern Somerset, just south of Bristol and Bath, in the Mendip Hills, which are all limestone, there used to be quite a lot of properties where the foul water and sewage just went into the ground. They had these little, you know, sinkholes, and you just discharged by pipe, but into the ground, into the limestone. And eventually, it comes out in the spa at Bath and the aqua spa. So if anybody's been to Bath and the waters of the spa, that's what it is. It's perfectly clean. It's the best way of cleaning it out there. It could take about 4,000 years, but it does explain why it's all hot and bubbly. I remember coming across once in the south of Bristol in the Chew Valley, which is all the reservoirs are for to serve Bristol. And it was a house over a stream. The house was built over a stream, and how they got rid of the foul water and sewage is there was a hole in the ground with a lid on it in the middle of the house. And there's a lid on it, and they just put it down there. That's a bit unlawful. But anyway, no questions about that. Any more poems for us? I'm going to go through this page, and then let's see. I might go through Help to Buy. We'll have a break in about 10 minutes or so. Oh, there's something I need to change here. I thought I'd done it, but obviously haven't. I was looking at the notes just before we started. This is my sort of putting something in the wrong place in these notes. It's the heading of possession proceedings and coronavirus on page 7. I kind of hoped that I wouldn't be talking about this by now. If you'd have asked me in March of last year, that, will you still be talking about coronavirus in October of 2021? I'll say certainly not. It features even more so for this afternoon's commercial course for various reasons. We're going to face the consequences for many a year. But in residential, this page is important if you're buying with vacant possession, a property that's got tenants in at the moment, short-term tenants, because you shouldn't be exchanging contracts until the leases come to an end and the tenants have left. And it's actually a bit more difficult than it was. Firstly, for much of last year until September, the end of September, from the start of the lockdown at the end of March, there were no possession proceedings being heard for commercial or residential property in the courts. So there's still to this day a backlog. I'm not sure how much of a backlog now. They are concentrating, well, they certainly on the more, well, they're sort of prioritizing it. It's high rent arrears, 6 months or more in arrears with rent is what they're concentrating on in residential properties, and not necessarily on short-hold tenancies and Section 21 notices. Until June, you couldn't get enforcement officers, bailiffs around, which if the tenants dig their heels in, you have to in a residential property. But anyway, historically, as you know, short hold notice, you had to serve at least 2 months notice, terminating no earlier than the end of the initial 6 months and no earlier than the end of the fixed term. That went up to 3 months, then it went up to 6 months. It then went down to 4 months in England. It's still 6 months in Wales. That in England, it went down to 2 months is my mistake. It's in the wrong part of the notes. It should be referring to the next page. So you can scrap that for the second sentence of the third paragraph. The alternative is to show grounds for possession. You have to serve a notice seeking possession and then go off to court. And the most obvious ground is defined rent arrears, at least 2 months rent arrears when you go off, when you serve the notice and when you go to court. In those circumstances, the notice seeking possession had to be for 2 months. Historically, that went up to 6 months, unless you were dealing with things like illegal immigration or fraud or domestic violence cases. That's gone down to 2 months now. And there is a renters reform bill that they announced they're going to go ahead with, although nothing else has happened. But they say in government they're going to go ahead with this renters reform bill this year, this parliamentary year, which will get rid of Section 21 short hold notices. So you won't be able to serve a short hold notice. That is a pretty big change. But I'll tell you more about that. You can still obviously show grounds. And they say they'll speed up the process, the court process in those circumstances, but I'll rest assured tell you more about that when we actually do have a bill. I'll go to do Help to Buy, not in great detail. I don't know how many of you are happy and lucky enough in life to do Help to Buys, equity loans, but it all changed in April. You could sign up, it ceased being able to sign up for the old version of Help to Buy equity loans where you get a 20% maximum equity loan or 40% in London. But that's all changed now. The new version came in April. Under the old version, you had until the end of May to complete the building, the new building, and complete the purchase. Otherwise, you lost your equity loan. But fairly briefly, and then we'll have a break. The changes at first glance look sensible. I'm sure if you do a Help to Buy, there's so many of them going up now, then they do look sensible. But I'll just object to one thing. They decided to zone the new version because in the past, the purchase price had to be a maximum of £600,000 everywhere in the country, which in large parts of the country gets you very little, but in London, it gets you a lot, and in London, not that much in the southeast. So it's been zoned, but unfortunately, they've zoned it according to which regional TV channel you have. So in London, it's still 600,000 maximum. Whereas you've got them there, the Southeast 437,600. The one I object to is 224,400, the Northwest where I am. It's based on average house prices. You would not get anything around here for 224,400. You've priced out sort of most of Cheshire for Help to Buy. But I'm not sure what the Premiership footballers of Alderley Edge can get for and that, but there you go. It's because they base it on Greater Manchester and Merseyside and East Lancashire and the likes as well. And the other thing is, you'll appreciate if you've done these this last few months, is there's a few other changes, not most notably the predecessor was not just about first-time buyers. 80% of people who signed up were first-time buyers, but it was not limited. And the new Help to Buys is just for first-time buyers. And if you're co-purchasing, you must all be first-time buyers. And if you're spouses or civil partners, you must buy together, And so you have to be both of you first-time buyers again. They base it on the same definition as first-time buyer relief. For stamp duty land tax, which is obviously back on the agenda now, I never cease to be amazed about the number of people out there I've heard stories of claiming first-time buyer relief and prepared to sign declarations on a sale and purchase. One where they said that the estate agents had told them to try it on. But the solicitor got a bit suspicious, are you sure this is a first-time buyer if I'm selling your house at the same time? But they're out there. And also, you can't have ground rents in the leaseholds anymore for Help to Buy. It's going to be a peppercorn. If there's an estate rent charge, we'll come back to it in the last part of the morning. Section 121 is going to be excluded. This thing that allows a 99-year lease to be created. It's just gone 20 past 11. Let's think. No, I'll go to the next bit, and then we'll have a break, and I'll do a couple of other areas afterwards. You've got reference to first homes on page 10. I won't spend ages on this. It came in June. It's a new type of affordable housing to get on the property ladder. Now, let's assume for the most part you're in the southeast of England listening in or looking in. I don't think you'll see it for a while in the southeast or in southern England generally, because they've started off. The government says there's going to be hundreds of thousands of these. So one day, if they're correct, you might just come across them. There are similarities to things already in place. But for whatever reason, this is affordable housing to help first-time buyers get on the property ladder. Same definition of first-time buyer as SDLT again. They've decided to start in the East Midlands and the northeast of England, which are not exactly the parts of the country where first-time buyers have problems getting on the property ladder, so I'm not sure what they're thinking of there. But basically, it's the third paragraph down, qualifying the price no more than £250,000 purchase price in most of the country, 420,000 in London, no more than a combined income of 80,000 or 90,000 in London. And you can buy at least 30% off, or if the local authority decided more, 40 or 50% off actual market value. How can they sell to you, the builders, 30% off? The answer is They probably put the purchase price up by 30%, is usually the case. No, it's going to be on value, the market value. The builder won't have to pay community infrastructure levy. And there are funds available. It only applies to planning permissions that are granted from June this year. So even in the Northeast and the East Midlands, you're not going to start seeing them for a while for the most part. But you get this property off, quite a lot cheaper than it might have been. The local authority in the planning conditions can impose conditions. They must impose conditions such as you've got to have a local connection. You get things like this all over the place in Cornwall already. You're going to have a local connection with the locality. You're going to have family there, job there or whatever. And or you've got to be a key worker, like a nurse or a teacher or something like that. And if you ever come across them, and I don't think it'll be for a while, then the bigger issue that clients need to be aware of is that when they come to sell, they have to sell. Mortgage companies are aside, mortgagee is not bound by this when they sell, because they wouldn't lend otherwise. But when they come to sell, they have to sell to somebody with the same local connection and or a key worker, and they have to sell with the same discount per pro rata with any change in price. So you're not getting something for nothing. You're having to sell at 30%, whatever it is, off. The land registry have concocted a restriction based on a Form L. You can't become registered proprietor unless this has happened. But we'll finish on that. It's 24 minutes past. Let's start again at, let's say, well, you need at least 50. Let's say 20, just after 20 to 12. And give yourself 15, 16, 17, 18 minutes or something. And then I'll say, I'll try and finish for lunch. I need a best part of an hour break. So we'll finish for the morning session soon after 1:05, something like that. Okay, right. I am going to put think of some questions during the break, and I'm going to put my camera off. So when I stand up, you can't see what I'm wearing. I'll see you shortly. Anybody got any further questions? Any questions in the chat box about the first part? Is anybody there? Okay, I'll make a start on the second part and say it's a similar kind of time period to the first, but you've got on page 11. I mean, I think this is bizarre, but if the government's to be believed, we're going to start seeing these as well, this page 11, these new model shared ownership leases. Again, some lucky people there are going to be doing shared ownership leases. I think it's the kind of classic that people equate cheaper properties means cheaper conveyancing. And often it's the exact opposite. Shared ownership flat. I think your worst nightmare in conveyancing will be something like either a help to buy or worse, a shared ownership flat acting on the purchase or a help to buy flat for that matter, acting on the purchase in a high-rise block with combustible cladding. That's the one that's not going to go through, especially if the block of flats is on a septic tank. That's a real danger. But hopefully not. That would be interesting. With a Japanese knotweed communal area. And somewhere on the England-Wales border, right, straddling the border, right on the border. Even if you do a lot of shared ownerships, you might not have come across these new model shared ownership leases yet because they only apply to funding, as of early in the summer. Or if you're getting planning permission and part of the planning conditions is you've got to have affordable housing shared ownership leases. So you're starting to see these things now, and it's a massive change to shared ownership. The one good thing about shared ownerships is the leases tend to look pretty much the same. One of the problems they got at the moment is you get in developments where some parts of the development are new model shared ownership leases and some parts aren't, depending on the phase developments and the likes. Some parts have got help to buy, the old version, and some parts have got new version of help to buy, and it's causing a bit of chaos. But anyway, you will start to see them, I say, in the future. In the past, I've seen exceptions to this in London, actually. Under the previous shared ownership leases, you started off buying a 25% share in your property and then staircasing up no less than 10% tranches until one day you would aspire to be the unencumbered owner of that property. And if it was a flat, you'd remain as a leaseholder, but with no 100% share. And if it was a house, you'd almost certainly get a transfer of the freehold to you. The new model shared ownership leases, you can start off with a minimum 10% share, and somebody just rent and be flexible about it, because I don't think you got much of a chance, especially in the southeast, of staircasing up to 100% if you start off with 10%. But even stranger, for the first 15 years, you're allowed to staircase up at 1% shares. You don't have to, obviously, it can be more than that, anything you like. But you can staircase up at 1% shares. Then after 15 years, 5% minimum. If you get the maths wrong, if you've sort of staircased up 3 times at 1% share, that means, within the first 15 years, you can't actually ever get to 100%, because it's going to be multiples of 5. And I mean, if you do this, the developers, the housing associations can't charge for you to staircase up your 1% share. They can't charge an admin charge, and any valuation, the new valuation will be based, or the valuation of 1% will be based on property price inflation in that locality. So you won't need a valuation. But the conveyancers can charge. It's not a difficult thing to do. But how much would you charge to staircase up 1%? And the answer is it depends on how much work there is. And there's exactly the same amount of work to staircase up at 1% as there is to staircase up at 50% or 75%. And I would want to charge exactly the same amount of money. Yeah. And if they weren't prepared to pay that, I would let them go elsewhere. I'd suggest another firm in the locality does the work, preferably one that you don't get on with, and recommend them. That's always the thing to do. So that's one thing. Currently, previously, I should say, the durations tend to be 99, 125-year leases. The new shared ownerships just give a complete disincentive to do anything. The leases will be in 990-year leases. And also the landlord will not be able to charge a service charge for structural exterior works. And for the first 10 years, the tenants for other works will be entitled to at least up to £500 per year to do work on the premises. If he doesn't do it in 1 year, then they can hold it over to the next. So that's that one. The government's also, the last sentence on this page, the mind boggles, introducing the right to buy your council house or housing association social housing short-term lease on right to shared ownership. A mixture of council house right to buy and shared ownership lease all into one. And I suspect you're still busy in the world of conveyancing, commercial and residential at the moment, busy as you've ever been, and most people I talk to for a sustained period anyway. And certainly at the moment, I think there's better work to do, more lucrative work to do than do things like right to buy on a shared ownership lease. I'd have to be on the bread line before I took that on, quite honestly. So I don't know if you've got questions about that. A couple of one miscellaneous area, and then a few cases, and then we'll get on to estate rent charges. I was mentioning some of this earlier in the year, actually, but things have moved on a little bit. Planning permission on page 12 and changes there. The government's got a lot of things planned in relation to planning permission. In England only, planning permission in England and Wales is getting quite different. It's completely delegated to the Welsh government and they're not changing anything. Some of the changes, there's meant to be a planning bill introduced this parliamentary year, which makes it easier to build all over the place, or was going to. Now Robert Jenrick's, the housing minister, has been sacked and replaced by Michael Gove. And because they lost the Tories lost the Amersham and Chesham by-election, I suspect a lot of it is going to go out the window. So I haven't really bothered too much about that. It may never happen. But already various parts of planning permission have changed. One I might have mentioned before actually is the first paragraph there. In August of last year, this is page 12, first paragraph proper under the bold. You can build 2 additional stories to a purpose-built block of flats. It's got to be purpose-built. You can build 2 additional stories without planning permission as long as the total amount doesn't exceed 30 meters the whole building, which is about 10 stories again, and the total of the additions is no more than 2 stories. And so people can add a couple of extra flats to the top of their buildings, purpose-built only. It's subject to prior approval. I don't know if you've come across this before. You will have done, but you might not realise. You have to lay the plans in front of the council for 56 days, and if they don't object, you've got your prior approval, or if they do consent. Well, they can make it conditional, but they can object, for instance, on the grounds, as it mentions, of things like traffic and highway impacts. There's nowhere to park your car because you've got 2 additional flats. Or they can object on the grounds of, as it mentions, natural lights being blocked. The appearance is not right. Or, of course, they can object on the grounds of flooding. I've always thought that if the 2 additional stories are in danger, the top floors are in danger of flooding, it's bad if you bought the basement flat. That's just general for prior approval. One of the problems, it's similar already, this prior approval, to things like single-story extensions at the back of your house. You need prior approval, but not planning permission since 2013. What problems you get? The additional makes your life a bit more difficult. That hold on. So that's one of the issues, if you like. Or they'll realise that, well, I came across one, I remember, that there was a conversion, it was a townhouse converted into flats, common enough, self-contained flats, and the top floor flat, there was a ridged roof. And the people in the top floor had converted the ridged roof into another bedroom, the attic space. And they'd done a good job. They got building regs and everything. It looked, by all accounts, quite nice. But they didn't realise until about 8 years later, when they came to sell, that it wasn't their attic. It was the landlord's who hadn't been devised to them. And I've never ceased to be amazed about the number of people living in the wrong flat. I came across one where it seems to have happened as it was a new build, and they'd turned up at the site office to pick up the keys of their new flat, and the plans were upside down. So they picked up the wrong keys, headed right instead of left down the corridor, and moved in and didn't realise for 10 years till they sold. And somebody else was living in their flat. Came across Northern Rock, if you remember them, repossessing the wrong flat. Not the worst thing they ever did. This is in the afternoon notes, but I do want to mention it briefly, a bit more briefly in the morning. So there's 1 or 2 things that in the morning and the afternoon notes. Briefly mention those EWS1 certificates this afternoon for the people who weren't here this morning, but only briefly. Class A1 in September of this last year, just over a year ago now. Class A1 shops, A2 financial and professional services, and A3 restaurants and cafes, and B1 businesses all became one big use. So you don't need planning permission within the same uses. And it's now one big Class E with a few exceptions like pubs and takeaways. So you can now convert without planning permission. You'll be glad to know your solicitor's practice can now become a restaurant without planning permission. You could start, well, you have to get prior approval, but you could start in 7 weeks from now. Or a combined solicitors restaurant, I think, is another possibility. But why? That's not directly important in residential. More of that this afternoon. There's the bottom of page 12. Since August the 1st this year, that big Class E, general business, retail, and so on, is you don't need planning permission to convert into Class C3, which is dwellings, not C4, which is houses and multiple occupation, but C3. Again, you need prior approval, and there are a few exceptions, but there's this new Class MA, mercantile abode is what that stands for, if you're interested. So all these redundant shops, there's exceptions, your provisos, as you can see, it's going to have been vacant for at least 3 months. It's got to have been in commercial use for at least 2 years and be no more than 1,500 square meters gross internal floor area. For some years, there's been similar provisions in relation to offices, and lots of redundant offices have become student halls with residents or flats and the likes. They've almost reached saturation point. But this is the brave new post-pandemic world where all the shops subject to prior approval can become residential, and you'll have very great difficulties finding out whether there's prior approval of being given unless it's conditional. You'll have equal difficulty in Hackney because they've still not recovered all their local land charges from when they were hacked into at the beginning of the year. It looks now that they're never going to, unless they're on other sources like listed buildings you can find elsewhere. Anyway, I suspect not the last local authority to lose all their searches through hacking. So there we are. There are exceptions like national parks and World Heritage sites, and listed buildings are accepted. Didn't put in the notes, but also military explosive areas and firing ranges. If you've been telling people to build blocks of flats on firing ranges or military explosive areas, get in touch with them in the break and tell them not to. You need planning permission and probably not going to get it. But that's that one. Again, if there's any questions, do ask. There's a few cases, one or two of which I'm not going to mention every last case. On page 14, and I will mention some. Then there's one specific area, and then we got onto estate rent charges and the likes revisited. The one that's changed a lot this last year is not so much estate rent charges. It does take a long time, quite a while to get through. The one that's changed a lot is ground rents. And I say it's not all bad news when we got onto ground rents and leaseholds. Reduced the size of the notes quite a lot from previous years, ground rents. I've mentioned Triple Rose and BT before. It's the case from the summer of last year, and it's not the only case that says it. On page 14 at the top. I suspect some of you have come across in conveyancing Airbnb. And even if you haven't, I suspect without you knowing, people who've purchased properties have entered into Airbnb agreements not too dissimilar from holiday lets in many respects. And Triple Rose is a leasehold premise. It's equally applicable to freehold covenants, but it was a leasehold property, flat in a block. And they'd entered into Airbnb agreements, and some of the other tenants objected to this. People having parties and the like, so they wanted an injunction stopping the Airbnb. And the upper tribunal said that Airbnb would be a breach of a private dwelling covenant, not to use other than as a private dwelling or single private dwelling. Subletting, a short hold tenancy is fine. Well, Airbnb is not a private dwelling. And it could also be a breach of a covenant not to run a trade or business as well. So they got their injunction stopping the breaches. It didn't say in the case, that doesn't say in the notes, but you'd also be in breach of your mortgage, unless the mortgage company had agreed, by doing Airbnb, just like holiday lets. And also you're certainly in danger of vitiating your buildings insurance and contents insurance. And it's not a clever thing to do. I have seen or heard of examples of, often solicitors wouldn't even know, conveyancers, but I have come across examples of, you get the clients who tell you things you really didn't need to know at the very last moment between exchange and completion. And I've had people telling me stories about the clients contact them just before completion, having exchanged contracts. It's Airbnb is what we're going to do. And you'd have to warn them of the consequences. And if they've got a mortgage, you'd have to get their consent to tell the mortgage company. If they didn't consent, you'd have to refuse to act, even though you've exchanged. I think that's it. Clients who do the stupidest things. That's a course I could have run, actually. Clients do the stupidest things. The strangest I've ever come across was years back, actually. It's nothing to do with Airbnb, but it was down in Plymouth. And there was a chain, sort of early afternoon completion on a Friday, normal kind of thing, big chain. And they rang up the solicitors first thing in the morning to this client saying, I'm not going to be able to move today because I was arrested. They've been trying to phone up all morning. As soon as the office is open, they're on the phone. I can't move today because I've been arrested by the police in a dawn raid for drug dealing and thought you should be the first to know. So just a few hours before completion, you've suddenly found your client's suspected drug dealer and all their money is in your account waiting for completion. And they had to tell the money laundering officer who told the NCA, who didn't get back in time, and none of the chain moved. And the worst of it was that this hapless client had been told by the police, you've been arrested for drug dealing. You're allowed to make a phone call and contact your lawyers. So they decided to contact their conveyancer to get them off. My conveyancer will get me off this rap. And that's the way people are. Other cases, I'll leave the Holland Park to you. I'll mention Duval. This is not a case I've mentioned before, actually. But it is a Supreme Court case from just over a year ago, I think now. The Amazon man is now turning up. I can see from my vantage point here. Word of warning, when I'm not doing conferences, if the Amazon man turns up, person turns up, they tend to just sort of come into the driveway and a screech of brakes and do a handbrake turn and throw something generally in the direction of the front door. But if I'm doing a conference, they can sense it and they'll be banging and even ringing the bell. That's not too bad. But anyway, don't know if you heard that. I used to do these conferences downstairs originally, but then I realized they were going to be sort of permanent part of my life. So I came upstairs and I used to have them just at the back of the house this way, but turn up at the patio doors and banging on the patio doors. They never do that usually. But anyway, Duval and 1113 Randolph Crescent, Maida Vale. This was 3 townhouses, I say Maida Vale, that have been knocked into one building with 11 self-contained flats. And that's 2 of these flats were owned by Dr. Duval, which I've got to say is a pretty cool name. Sounds like they should be in some American crime series, Dr. Duval. But anyway, the lease, this is quite important in its own context, and it is a Supreme Court case. Probably tells you how expensive these properties were that they went to the Supreme Court. The lease contained a clause that you couldn't alter your premises without the landlord's consent not to be unreasonably withheld, which is pretty commonplace. But again, pretty commonplace in the flats. If you were going to carry out structural alterations, In particular, if you were going to cut it, you couldn't cut into or maim or injure, the wording, the walls, full stop. There's an absolute covenant, you can't cut into the walls. Now, if you've got an absolute covenant, then the landlord can always waive the requirement. Allow you to do so anyway. They don't have to, but they can. This particular lease also had provisions in all the leases. The landlord had to enforce any covenants at the behest of any other tenant. So if any other tenant wants you to enforce the leasehold covenants, you have to do so. Dr. Duval wanted to knock her 2 self-contained flats into one, which means cutting into the wall. And the landlord was asked for consent and waived the absolute requirement. They let you do it. But fellow tenants objected to this. If you get 11 flats, somebody's going to object to what you're doing. And they objected to it. And the Supreme Court eventually said that because you've got that covenant that you will enforce covenants at the behest of any tenants, you can't waive an absolute covenant. They can't knock into 2. And you see those provisions quite frequently. And it's not always major works like this. It can be things like not to keep pets, and some tenant wants to keep a goldfish, some long leaseholder. Any fellow leaseholder who gets wind of this can stop it, if it's an absolute requirement. And believe me, they will stop it. You'll find somebody. Not to run a trade or business from your premises. If you just keep taking work or home with you, that's fine. But there's a lot of people at the moment who run a trade or business when they didn't realize 2 years ago they were going to do so. Right, what have you got? Robert Duvall acted as the confidant of the Godfather in the movie of that name, I know. And he was that mad colonel in Apocalypse Now as well. I love the smell of napalm in the morning. Smells like victory, that one. Yep. Good films, both of them. The 5as and Marlborough Knightsbridge, quite a recent Court of Appeal case. It's Knightsbridge. I suspect it's quite an expensive property and probably people with more money than sense. They went all the way to the Court of Appeal over who owned the front door in this block of flats. Because the tenant wanted to replace the front door, and they can do so if they own it and not if they don't. And the front door that was part of the structure of the flat, they said, and therefore it's the tenants. So that's a good way of spending £150,000 in costs. Ownership of a front door. Yeah. Not too bothered about the Coppleston case. I'm going to mention this Harcus Sinclair. There are people within your businesses, if you are solicitors and not licensed conveyancers, who need to know about this, or even if you are licensed conveyancers, you'll be dealing with solicitors on the other side. It's a Supreme Court case from late July. Courts don't sit in August, the appeal courts at least. And this was one of the last cases. It confirms a Court of Appeal case from 2019. The reason there's been such a delay between the two is because for a long time last year, the courts weren't hearing cases. And it's incredibly important in conveyancing, but doesn't seem to have percolated through, primarily because it's not a conveyancing case. I wouldn't usually do non-conveyancing cases in these courses. If you're a solicitor and you give an undertaking, and you don't have to call it an undertaking to be an undertaking, I'll get the documents to you by the end of the week as an undertaking. Then what happens if you breach it? Well, A, you might be disciplined by the SRE. B, if there's a contract with consideration and somebody suffers loss as a consequence, you could be sued. But C, as solicitors or officers of the court, the High Court can require you to comply with the undertaking under threat of being struck off and the likes. Well, they make you comply with the undertaking. And it's not common to actually go to court, but the threat of that is a good way of, getting people to actually do what they've agreed under the undertaking. These were a couple of litigators, Harcus Sinclair LLP and your lawyers, and they'd reached agreement to share business and share information. And Harcus Sinclair, as part of this agreement, undertook that they wouldn't act together with any other firms, and they wouldn't share information with other firms. It was actually all about diesel emissions. There was sort of group actions against Volkswagen Group for lying about the diesel emissions, if you remember. Big news a few years back, and large numbers of claims have been brought as a consequence. So that was the background. Harcus Sinclair did basically breach this undertaking and sort of entered into an agreement with another firm of solicitors. And so your lawyers want to go to court to require compliance with the undertaking. And the Supreme Court said a limited liability partnership, or a limited company for that matter, can't be required to comply with an undertaking. They can still be disciplined, unlike people within the firm, but they can't be required to comply with the undertaking. Old-fashioned partnerships, of which there are not many, and sole practitioners can, but not LLPs, which are the large majority of firms now, or limited companies. And that is quite big. Obviously, why I mention it in the conveyancing course is because, well, conveyancing, especially domestic, relies more on undertakings than any other area of law. Yeah, you undertake, you discharge the charge, you undertake, you send the documents over, you undertake that you have the client's authority to act, and all these other things. You know, the code for completion by post is riddled with undertakings. Again, you could be disciplined. I've started to see some firms. Well, somebody's got the question there. That's what I was going to say. Is it good practice to ask for your undertaking from the individual? I suppose it's good practice to try, but I wouldn't give it. I, as an individual solicitor, wouldn't give an undertaking and be personally liable on it like that. I have seen some firms start to try and do that. There's two issues with that. Firstly, is the individual high enough in the firm, if you like, to, be able to give an undertaking. If the partner within the LLP or a director of a company, yeah. But secondly, would you actually want to give a personal undertaking? What needs to happen is, because LLPs have been around for 20 years now, and what needs to happen is that we need something from the SRA and the Law Society on it. I'm sure we'll get something one day. But like I say, I do stress you could still be, suffer the disciplinary actions. I remember coming across one a few years back. It was literally the solicitor saying that we undertake, you don't have to call it an undertaking. But they basically, we will set, we've got the documents now and we'll send them to you by next Tuesday. They didn't, and that was a breach of an undertaking. They were disciplined by the SRA. How do you deal with undertakings given by ILEX? But that's sort of a good point, because licensed conveyancers are not officers of the court, and SILEX are not officers of the court, and so it's no different. If you're obviously the firm, if you're SILEX or a licensed conveyancer within a firm of solicitors, then you can't give a personal undertaking which is enforceable through court anyway. So if it was sort of somebody from SILEX or a licensed conveyancer within an LP firm of solicitors, there's not much you can do. And say that threat is not there. I say the disciplinary action still is. I thought you'd like that one. I find it amazing because it was just, it was the end of July, and for whatever reason, it didn't percolate through at all. Though. Obvious reason, it's not convincing. I have seen discussions about it. It's no real difference than if you're dealing with a firm of licensed conveyancers already, But tell other people that fact. I mentioned this last time. I know somebody was asking me about what's on page 15. Any other questions on that? I'm sure you appreciate page 15. I've decided, I missed that one, sorry. Yeah, you can, how to enforce a SILEX or council license conveyancing undertaking? Well, I say it depends. The actual threat of court proceedings, it depends on solicitors being an officer of the High Court, whereas licensed conveyancers and the likes aren't. They could still be disciplined by their professional body. But if you were dealing with sort of a licensed conveyancing within an LLP firm of solicitors or a SILEX, which you frequently obviously are, more often than not, then you could rely on the fact that, or so we thought, the firm of solicitors would be bound by the undertaking, and that's not so in terms of court enforcement. It's an almighty mess. I say the one thing that's not caused, it's not being discussed all the time is people don't know about it. You probably know, but there's a surcharge for non-UK residents since April in England, not Wales, and I'll leave that to you. But I wanted to revisit in the last sort of part of the morning. It'll take a while. There's two areas. And so I'm still getting loads of questions. And it was one of the things advertised anyway. The last 3 or 4 pages of the notes will not take too long. The last couple will probably, last 3 will take practically no time. But I did want to mention revisiting estate rent charges. And you have headed to enforceability of positive covenants. I'll mention mortgage companies as well. I last checked the Lender's Handbook Part 2's sort of end towards the end, about just over a week ago. And I'll mention what the mortgagees are up to. I don't mention them in the notes, but I mean, people, I will say it, but you must check yourselves. People are still asking about this. I just wish to goodness the government would think about what legislation's really needed rather than messing around with some of the stuff it's talking about, which we'll come back to. The background is this. This is the first, on page 16, the first paragraph. Under this is what the problem is. It's the kind of stuff you do at your degree level land law courses. If you remember that day when you first in your life picked up a land law textbook and you started to read avidly the restrictive covenants chapter, and thought to yourself, this is what I want to spend the rest of my life doing. I don't know what we were thinking, but restrictive covenants were actually the last major chapter in all the textbooks, by which time most people thought they got enough to blag it through any examination and didn't really look at it, which is a shame really, because they're so fundamental to conveyancing of all sorts. Osterby and Oldham Corporation from the 1880s is one of the most disastrous cases in the whole of English property law, because it's the case that said restrictive covenants are recognized as property rights in equity, subject to things like registration. Nowadays, they bind third parties, subject to showing off on register or land charges if it's unregistered land. They'll bind third parties, but positive covenants are not property rights, and they won't automatically bind third parties. They're just contracts. And that was confirmed by a case called Ronan Stevens, a case from Somerset, Bridgewater Bay, back in the 1990s, House of Lords as they were. That wasn't about sort of maintenance and the likes. Maintenance is a positive covenant. Ronan Stevens was actually about flying freeholds. And it's the problem with flying freeholds. There was a sort of cottage next to a house, but the roof above the cottage was in the ownership of the house. And they, when the two properties were split up into two, the original title and the same title, then the person in the house covenanted that they would maintain and keep wind and weatherproof the roof. And then years later, this was back in 1960 as I recollect, years later third parties have got involved and the roof wasn't being repaired, and they went all the way to the House of Lords. And the House of Lords said that maintenance of the roof is a positive covenant, and you can't enforce positive covenants automatically against third parties. They're not property rights. And that's the problem with flying freeholds, and you do come across them, not just in Bridgewater Bay and Somerset, where you come across them typically in former council houses. Archways is the classic. Dog legs with one person's house over somebody else's. Bedroom over somebody else's property. Yeah, I've got somebody who's put something in the Q&As. I'm not sure when. Can you make sure it is the chat facility? Because I do miss the Q&As. I tend to be looking at the chat next to me. How do you get the conveyancer or the firm to comply with HMLR requirements without undertakings? Again, you can still get an undertaking. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. So we shouldn't like licensed conveyancers all the time. So you can still obtain undertakings, and you can still be disciplined, by the SRA if you're a solicitor and the likes. It's just that you can't get that threat of court action, which was a good threat in the past. Even if court action didn't proceed, it usually got people's minds thinking, we better do something about this. I would actually be careful about, accidentally giving undertakings, personal undertakings yourself, and say, I'll get the documents to you by Friday as an undertaking, which being held to me. That's a personal undertaking. I say, but you can still have undertakings. There's no problem with that. But anyway, how do you enforce maintenance? Well, over the years, it's become more and more important to be able to enforce maintenance provisions in freehold land. You can enforce maintenance in leasehold. And the reason is primarily because of local authorities and their planning policy, because they don't want to adopt all the roads anymore. And so you might have an adopted or to be adopted main road in the estate, but all the side roads are private. They're never going to be adopted and they need maintaining. And you need things like planning policy, as if you're going to build a certain number of houses, you have to set aside a certain amount of green space. And the green space has to be maintained and it won't be adopted. Sometimes parish councils take it over, but often not. And you need things like children have to have play areas as part of your planning conditions. They always put the kids' play area opposite the sheltered housing so they can annoy elderly people. You check next time. They have to have car parking areas and amenities and places for the rubbish bins and all these kind of places. Let's see who's another I've got. Somebody's asked me about how good's an undertaking. I thought this would get you talking. How good's an undertaking if it's not a firm of solicitors? Again, you could still be disciplined. And you might just have a contract if there's consideration, and if there's loss, you can threaten breach of contract. You just can't. Licensed conveyancing practices are not officers of the court like solicitors are. My friend, the master of the rolls, is in charge of you if you're a solicitor. Terry, or used to be. They anyway. So you need some form of maintenance. If you'd have asked me 20 years ago, 25 years ago, certainly, I'd have said the way you maintain private roads and open space, and the way you sort of deal with flying freeholds is direct covenants and restrictions. They weren't there in Stevens. I can sell to you my new build house, and we can agree a direct covenant between one another. We can agree a contract. You have to pay for maintenance, and if you breach that, I can sue you. How do I make sure that contract binds third parties? The way I would have done it years ago, and there's been a trend back to this for the new builds because of all the problems we're going to revisit. How I can make sure is by a direct covenant and restriction. I can require you in the contract, my purchaser, initial purchaser of the new build property, if you sell, your purchaser has to enter into a direct covenant with me. And I'll back it up with a restriction. If your purchaser can't become registered proprietor unless I agree, I'll agree if there's a restriction. I'll agree if there's a direct covenant, sorry. Now, why they fell out of favour, well, again, being resurrected, certainly a lot of the new build developments around here. Why they fell out of favour is because they become quite tricky, to deal with. What you would historically perhaps do, especially in the smaller developments, is you would, the builder would set up a management company, residence management company, at the end of the development or sometime later, and pass the management to them. And everybody have to become a shareholder or guarantor of the management company. Somebody would have to become a director of the management company that have to produce accounts and confirmation statements for Companies House. If they didn't do so, they'd eventually be struck off. And every time you came to sell, somebody ceased to be a shareholder, somebody else became a shareholder. And the whole thing was very, very tricky. You have to comply with the restrictions on a sale. The alternative is you might just transfer the management to some independent private management company, people like estates and management who would charge a lot of money. And there's no ability to question the reasonableness of administration charges in freehold. There is in leasehold flats, you can go off to a tribunal, but not in freehold. So they can charge you a lot of money every time you come to sell, and and likes for the just to do the job. Which is why number 3 really was number 2 in section 33, which is why estate rent charges started to be used. I've expanded on previous years if you've heard this from me before. I've been thinking about estate rent charges a lot during the lockdowns. That's how bad it's been. But the problem is at the moment, we don't know exactly when it's a rent charge or not. If it says it's a rent charge and it's in the transfer, it's a rent charge. But large numbers of occasions, we just don't have a clue. I have quoted Section 1 of the Rent Charges Act, 1977, sort of 2/3 of the way down, page 16. A rent charge is any annual or other periodic sum charged on or issuing out of land except rent under lease or interest payments. It's going to be periodic payments. If it's pure direct covenants and restrictions, it's not, as and when, but it's not a rent charge. That's no problem with that. But unless it's rent under a lease or interest payments, if it's a periodic payment issuing out of land, it's a rent charge. And it doesn't have to call itself a rent charge to be a rent charge. It might be called a service charge. It might be called a maintenance charge. There is an argument that if it's in the transfer, it's a rent charge. But my gut feeling is, and I won't go into the technicalities, is that all these things that are called service charges, full stop, are not rent charges. But I think you've got to err on the side of caution until we get a case on it. And we really need an appeal case before people will calm down on it. You know what the problem is. I've mentioned it to some of you before anyway. It's Section 121 of the Law of Property Act. If you don't pay your rent charge within 40 days of it becoming due, the person with the benefit can create a 99-year lease over your property, but you can exclude that. My gut feeling is if I was acting for a purchaser of a property and there's a periodic maintenance payment, I can understand the argument that that is not a rent charge. If it's called a rent charge, yes. But if it's not a rent charge, well, what's the problem with excluding Section 121? And what I would want to do is put something in the transfer to the effect that if this is a rent charge, Section 121 is excluded. I can't see what's wrong with that. And probably the other side's conveyancer is going to tell you, no, we're not going to accept that, quite possibly. But I don't err on the side of caution. I think the other argument, which I don't really put in the notes, I'm a bit reluctant to put too much down in the notes on it, is you get the other side. So it's one of those that where you're acting for a seller, you deny it's a rent charge, and the same people acting for buyers claim it is a rent charge, and we want Section 121 excluded. I think another argument, if there's pure direct covenants and restrictions, again, no problem. But if the seller says this is not a rent charge, then what is it? Because if it's not a rent charge and there's no direct covenants, restrictions, it's just a contract. And the contract doesn't bind third parties. And it says, if you're interested, Section 6.8.4 of the UK Finance Lenders Handbook, Part 1. This is the other thing I've done during the lockdowns. I've memorized the Lenders Handbook. If you want to test me on it, anybody, any particular section, just put it down and I'll tell you instantly. But Section 6.8.4 says in relation to drains and sewers, if the roads are not going to be adopted, then you've got to confirm that in your reasonable opinion, which is typical mortgage company speak, in your reasonable opinion, there's adequate maintenance and support, no likes. And you can't confirm that. You can't comply with the lender's handbook. Now again, I'm going to concentrate on the estate rent charges. Get onto ground rent shortly, which is, I say, to all intents, the last topic of the day. But there are two types of rent charges I've mentioned in past years. Firstly is where it's fixed sum. It doesn't vary. It's a fixed amount. You can't create fixed sum rent charges since the Rent Charges Act of 1977 came into force in July of that year. And existing fixed sum rent charges come to an end on the 60th anniversary, 2037. That's a bit of, put that in the diaries because I'm having a party that day. But in some parts, a lot of the country, you rarely see these fixed sum rent charges. They tend to be not uniquely, but last half of the 19th century, first quarter of the 20th. What is the CML handbook provision for Islamic mortgages? I forgot that one, but I'm going to come back to Islamic mortgages. I think it's just part 2 anyway, isn't it? See part 2. I was going to mention Islamic mortgages in a different context shortly. You've got me on that one. It's usually in somewhere in sections. There'll be section 6 point something then. You've got me on that. You've tricked me in that one. But more of that perhaps later, very briefly, admittedly. But please don't start asking what various sections of the lender's handbook are. But that would be tragic beyond recognition. Now, those fixed sum rent charges can't be created anymore. In some parts of the country, they are very common, including not far north of here, North Cheshire, Stockport, Greater Manchester, Oldham, Manchester generally, Salford, Rochdale, into Merseyside, Warrington and Widnes, if you know North Cheshire. All those kind of areas, you get loads. You couldn't do your job without doing them. Most of the southeast, they're quite a rarity. If there's anywhere that beats the northwest, it's the west country. Bristol is ground zero, and Bath, and Weston-super-Mare, if you know that one. First house I ever bought was in Bristol, and it had a rent charge of 2 guineas a year. It's that kind of figure. I never kept pace with inflation. And every year somebody would knock on the front door and demand £2.10 from me, which I dutifully paid until I moved, and then found it was actually drugs related. It was nothing to do with rent charges. No, it was a rent charge. Didn't know anyway. But a few years ago, the solicitors of Bristol and Manchester used to just do as a custom. You knocked off the equivalent of 6 years rent charge from the price, and that's probably about 30 or 40 quid. You can't do that now. What you can do is create, since 1977, the rent charges in section 2, which I've mentioned in its entirety. On page 17, it's sections 2, subsection 3, paragraph C. You can create an estate rent charge. And there are 2 types of estate rent charge in subsection 4. By far the most common nowadays is B. It's where it's created for the purpose of meeting or contributing towards the cost by the performance by the rent owner of covenants for services, maintenance, repairs, insurance. Basically, as a way of binding purchasers. You'll have a rent charge to enforce the service charge payments, if you like. And subsection 5 goes on to say the rent charge of more than a nominal amount shall not be treated as a state rent charge unless it represents a payment of the performance by the rent owner of such covenants as was mentioned above, and it's reasonable. You can have a nominal amount and still be valid. You don't have to, but that's why you sometimes frequently see £1. That's the nominal amount. If you end up with £10, it's not nominal. But £1 or £2. And then you pay money in relation to maintenance and repairs and the likes. And it can't have a profit element. It's just got to be relating to maintenance and repairs, and it's got to be reasonable. I wish I could tell you exactly when something's a rent charge. I can tell you exactly what it is, but unfortunately, there's a huge, huge grey area. Thanks for that one. Well, I'll text Terry later about that one. But anyway, can I talk about the real problem on page 18? I'll leave the. Is the service charge vatable? It would be if it was reserved as rent, so they usually are. Yeah, it should be. The real problem on page 18 is, well, it depends a lot on the circumstances, actually, whether it's vatable, and because it wouldn't apply to building work. It should actually apply, coming to think of it, to maintenance work. I'm not sure it always does. But anyway, page 18, if you want to know that for certain, I'd ask an accountant. I wash my hands of most things to do with tax if I humanly can. I've decided that SDLT is not conveyancing anymore. Best left to accountants, apart from its simplest form. Section 121 I've mentioned on the bottom of page 18. I've mentioned this before, but you couldn't do updates without mentioning this. I'll tell you the latest state of play. Section 121 of the Law of Property Act has been around since 1881, the predecessor. It's in the 1925 Law of Property Act, but there was a predecessor in the early 1880s. And for 135 years, it didn't cause problems. It's the provision that says, or quoted section 121, subsection 1 at the top, but it's the provision, just under the heading, it's the provision that says that if you don't pay within 40 days, whether demanded or not, the rent owner, the beneficiary, can create a 99-year lease over your property. And section 1213 says that if you don't pay within 40 days, they can go into possession. They never want to go into possession. What they want to do is create a 99-year lease over your property. Of all the cases I mentioned in courses, all the cases that have been heard, property type cases, since, well, in the careers of anybody practicing at the moment, I'd say that Robertson Lawton changed your jobs like few others. It's probably in the top 5, certainly. The only case that really did change your jobs more dramatically was that case in the year 2000, Cottingham and Attenborough-Jones, all about building regulations. Sort of started this whole industry of building regs insurance and like, building regs can potentially be enforceable years down the line. That was the start of the rot. That's when you stopped being conveyancers and started to be obtaining endless documents that you can't judge what they mean when you get them. But Robertson Lawton just came completely out of the blue. Shortly, we're going to come back to ground rents as the last topic, all but the last topic of the day, or the morning, I should say. To refresh your memories, if you've come across it before, I say it involved quite a lot of properties in Bristol, yes, including Lawton's property. These were sort of late 19th century properties in Bristol. Because I'd lived there, take it from me that majority of late 19th century properties, pre-First World War properties, had these rent charges on. Significant majority. And the amount of rent charge, the payments were between £6 and £15 per annum. Businesses buy up these rent charges, this portfolio of rent charges. And the reason they do it is to enforce section 121. Mr. Roberts is the managing director of a business called Morgoyd, who bought up about 16,000 Bristol and Manchester rent charges and loads of ground rents. And they buy next to nothing. They buy a whole portfolio, somebody whose great-great-great-granddad imposed these things in the 19th century and they've just inherited. And save them wandering the streets of Bristol demanding £2.10 from people like themselves. They sort of, we'll take these rent charges off your hands, £3 a time and that kind of thing. They claim to have demanded these rent charges, but the demands seem to have gone to the wrong address on occasion and being addressed to predecessors. But it doesn't matter. You're supposed to pay the money whether demanded or not. When I used to live in Bristol, I came across this happening, and it wasn't completely out of the blue. But why this case arose and changed your jobs, changed conveyancing, is because they wanted to create a 99-year lease over these people's properties, and the land registry refused to register it and noted against the title. And they went up to the tribunals, and eventually the upper tribunals said, you've got to register it. It's created by a rent charge. You have to register it. And so you didn't pay £6 for 40 days, even though you weren't told you had to. Somebody else has got a 99-year lease over your property. The worst of it was what they went on to say, and that's if you then pay off the arrears, the 99-year lease stays. And you'll never be able to sell or mortgage your property unless you pay for that lease to be surrendered. And they're making an absolute fortune through surrendering these leases. The lease would bind the mortgage company as long as the rent charge was created first, which is always the case. And it took a while for Robertson Lawton to percolate through. I was mentioning it in court. I'd come across it because I know quite a lot of people in Bristol still. It was a talk of the place for a while. Some solicitors still don't know about it. But the real significance for you people is that it applies to all rent charges, including all these estate rent charges. Hence, you can exclude section 121, but you've got to do so in the instrument creating the rent charge. If it's a rent charge or if there's a doubt, I'd want section 121 excluded. Yeah. And you might get somewhere, you might not. And if it's not excluded already, then I'd want it a deed of variation. I've seen problems where the builder's gone out of business. So, you can't get your deed of variation. I've seen some developers give you a deed of variation for nothing or for 150, 200 quid. I came across one where there was two management companies, private management companies. She's in Southport and Merseyside. And so they had to get two deeds of variation. One was managing the green space and one was managing the roads. And they quoted a combined cost of £11,000 for a purchase and get mortgage. Anybody got any anecdotes about a witty anecdote about estate rent charge? Have you got any poems about estate rent charges that you can quote to me? Anyway, the first mortgage company to say anything in the part twos was Barclays, about 3 years ago now, it must have been. And Barclays, together with quite a few others, say that, although different time periods, we want either a mortgagee protection clause whereby we're given at least 21 days notice, as if Barclays could get their act together in 21 days, but we'll be given at least 21 days notice before any action's brought. We'll find out about the arrears, add it to the mortgage. Or we want section 121 excluded, or we want a management company, residence management company comprised of the freeholders of the houses, but it's got to be limited by shares, not guarantee. Most of them guarantee nowadays, majority. If you've got one of those three, they'll lend. Otherwise, they'll need a deed of variation. People like, I think Aldermore say the same now. And Kensington say the same. I think they might have different time periods for the mortgagee protection clause, but they say a similar thing. And the Yorkshire Building Society and their subsidiaries, who are Accord and Barnsley and Chelsea, two separate building societies, that is. It's not the Barnsley and Chelsea. That'd be interesting. Welcome to Barnsley, twinned with Chelsea. I'd watch that programme. But anyway, others like Nationwide, like everything to do with Nationwide, it's a book. They've changed 3 times since in the Mortgage Works. I think so. Coventry Building Society say similar things. They want a mortgagee protection clause with at least 2 months' notice. They want, and also they want either section 121 excluded or provision that in the transfer that if a lease is created over the property, once the arrears have been paid, it'll be surrendered on a non-profit basis, reasonable admin charge. But they always want a mortgagee protection clause. The alternative as a policy, they are mortgagee-only policies, and Nationwide say we want to accept policies. Quite a few mortgagees, you'll have to check with the mortgage company, not all of them check, and we'll obviously make clear to the client that they're mortgagee-only. It's quite possibly the easiest way of dealing with it, their disputes, but make sure the client is aware. So one day we might actually have, all they need to deal with this is have a piece of legislation saying that in freehold land, positive covenants can be enforced against third parties. Problem solved. It's a bit too easy. The legislators. I'm going to revisit in the last parts. I said the last pages will take a minute. But this has moved on quite a lot. And I'm going to revisit on page 21, ground rent issues. And so I'll concentrate on the stuff that's moved on. I was mentioning this every time I've talked to AstenJ, because it's been such a talking point this last few years. These doubling ground rents, escalating ground rents on long leasehold, usually flats, but also houses. They've always been there, but they became big news. When I say a mortgagee protection clause, where basically it's like you're getting shared ownership, say a mortgagee protection clause. You'd have to create it, and say either a deed of variation or sort of. It should be basically you're given X amount of days notice, and you create it within the transfer. I mean, it's sort of. I say the bigger problems come to with deeds of variation. It's very similar to getting shared ownership. If you fall into arrears, then you need a mortgagee protection clause. The mortgagee pays off, gets paid off. But they started off big time in these escalating ground rents with the credit crunch a dozen more years ago now. It doesn't seem like it. And it's because flat prices in particular plummeted with the credit crunch in 2008, 9, 10. I can remember back in Manchester and Leeds and things, Cardiff Bay as well. People were completing on new build flats that they'd exchanged when they were off plan, and they were 55% of what you'd paid for them. And then people couldn't get mortgages and the likes. But the developers always want to transfer the sort of the reversions of these blocks of flats to big, like people like Aviva and pension funds and hedge funds. And they suddenly found that the price had gone down dramatically. How can we transfer this for the same price? We'll have some provision whereby the rent doubles every 10 years or something, 15 years. And it was a disaster waiting to happen. It started to become popularized when people like myself were going into courses in the summer of 2015, mentioned that Supreme Court case from South Wales, Arnold and Britton, which I've certainly mentioned to some before. 99-year leases of holiday chalets in Oxwich Bay on the Gower Peninsula, South Wales. And they started off in the early 70s paying £90 per annum, but the ground rent doubled every 10, sorry, it didn't double, sorry, I'm talking about. It increased every year, 10% compound interest. Now, I'm no mathematician. I chose law as a career to avoid maths. I don't consider myself, I don't want to be a mathematician. I think lots of property lawyers don't make very good mathematicians. I would consider myself to be an artist, and that's the way I want to be remembered in life. But I can sort of remember paying 10% compound interest over 99 years is not a good idea. After some years, they start to notice the ground rent increasing quite rapidly. They do the maths and find to their horror that by the last year of the lease, 2072, they'll be paying £554,000 per annum. And they went all the way to the Supreme Court arguing that this can't be what was intended, it's a mistake. And the Supreme Court said it might be a mistake, but it's unambiguous, it's what you have to pay. These were the ones without sea views. If you wanted a sea view, it was over £1 million. And I remember mentioning that in courses back in 2015, 16, 17, and solicitors telling me stories about, the ground rent started off at 250 quid per annum, doubled every 10 years for the next 150 years, and the final 10 years will be more than £4 million per annum. And clients were just saying, get on with it. And they're probably amongst the ones suing the solicitors. Now there are thousands of claims pending. I suspect most of which will fail. The worst I came across was somebody I know, a friend of mine who's in a big London firm, better not mention who, or she won't be a friend anymore, but she's a partner in this, is nowadays anyway, partner in this big London firm. And I was chatting to her, must have been a couple of years back now. And she told me that she was acting on the purchase of a flat in Waterloo, somewhere near the station, some skyscraper, glass palace, multi-million quid flat. was an Asian investor. These don't ever see it, so just buys it as an investment property, doesn't live there. These blocks are empty. But the ground rent started off at £450 per annum, not that unusual. I've seen similar things in Battersea Reach. But it doubled every 10 years for the next 999 years, which would make anybody want to put in the chat facility what the final 10 years would be? Nobody? I'd be a bit shocked if you told me. It'd be a bit like Rain Man. But it would be more pounds per annum than the number of atoms in the known universe, because it exponentially rises. On a train journey when I was bored, I tried it out actually, and it just clogged up the whole computer calculator on my phone after about 400 years. It keeps doubling and doubling and doubling. Thousands of zeros. But they told the developer solicitors, we can't accept this. And the developer solicitors, who are a big London firm, said, we know there's a problem, but we've already sold 30 flats and you're the first to say anything. The same 30 people have missed that, or the same person 30 times is another possibility, unfortunately. I'll mention Monsola. It's actually in the afternoon notes, but I will mention it this afternoon, but it makes me giggle, and not everybody's here this afternoon. I'd like to meet this particular solicitor who let this go through. It was a 25-year lease of a solar farm for solar panels, industrial sort of solar panels in South Wales as well, near Cardiff. They don't seem to, they seem to have problems with maths around there. The ground rent started at the rent started at £15,000 per annum. It increased every year by retail prices index. But the way it was drafted, you didn't just add RPI for that year. For the first year, it was RPI increase. Then it was retail prices index for the second year, but then you added the first year plus RPI, and then the third year, second and first year. So it started off at £15,000 per annum, and it would have ended at just over 76 million if retail prices index remains the same as for the last 25 years. 76 million. And it went to the Court of Appeal this summer, and the Court of Appeal decided that it was an obvious mistake and it should be 30,000. And I think they're incredibly lucky. Right? If it's an unconscionable term, and people don't usually come across solicitors mentioning anything that's unconscionable in before, even if it was overly could have been intended anyway as a binding term in that form. I think what they said about Arnold and Britton doesn't square with Monsola. They said it's clear and it's unambiguous and it's what you agreed. But in Monsola, they said it was just such a mistake, an obvious mistake, that they basically rewrote it. And Arnold and Britton is Supreme Court. So take your pick. They don't really square with one another. You can't have implied binding terms if they go contrary to clear express terms. And the Supreme Court said there's no ambiguity in Arnold and Britton. I mentioned that Monsola because I've seen residential ground rents increases, which are not always just doubling every 10, 20 years or whatever. I've seen things like that. I remember seeing them in a place called Keynsham between Bristol and Bath, from 1980s flats. And sometimes, unless you are of a mathematical disposition or the kind of person who likes cryptic crosswords, which I am not, I cannot stand them, then you really have to think about what the rent reviews means. What does that rent increase actually do? Now, if I've got any problems whatsoever understanding the rent increase, I think I might tell the client you should go and ask a valuer what it means, what it's likely to be. Suffice to say, if the rent could increase, no matter what the rent increase is, even if it's retail prices index or consumer prices index, I would tell the client about it and make sure the client doesn't blame me later. Because I suspect there's been a lot of solicitors a few years back who told clients about the rent increases but can't prove it. Again, the principles of equity trump the law, not in this particular circumstance. They might in terms of equitable remedies, like whether you get an injunction or not, but not in this, it's a purely contractual thing. And that's what you've contractually agreed. There are things you can do about it. If you've been misrepresented things, you could sue for misrepresentation and the likes. But that's what the Supreme Court said. It's clear and it's unambiguous. And unfortunately, in some of the examples, the solicitors are going to be dragged down with it. That county personnel Eleanor Pulver case was actually a 1980s commercial property case, which said that part of the solicitor's job is to tell your client about onerous lease clauses. And that was an onerous commercial rent review. Because you didn't tell your client about it, then they got sued. If I was reporting to a mortgage company until May of 2017, not a single mortgage company had anything in their Part 2s about rents, ground rent increases. Now they all do. Nationwide, as per usual, the first, and they've changed on several occasions since. But Nationwide, together with most mortgage companies, say we won't accept ground rents that double at less than 20-year intervals, for instance. Some say 21 years, some say 25 years, one or two, not many. A lot of mortgage companies say nowadays, the problem is that people didn't have any problem getting mortgages 6 years ago when they bought that flat, but now they're budgets, they can't get a mortgage and they blame you people. A lot of mortgagees have got things like, if it's a new build, the ground rent must be no more than 0.1% of the value. And if it's a non-new build, 0.2%, I think Nationwide said non-new build 0.5%. And the value is not the same as the purchase price. That means you have to see the valuation report, which the Nationwide don't give you. Unless they've changed within the last 9 days since I checked. The strangest is still, and they better change shortly, but Barclays, because Barclays will not accept a high ground rent or a low ground rent. It's got to be a Goldilocks ground rent. It's got to be just right. They will not accept a peppercorn. And then they go on to say that we will accept a zero ground rent, a peppercorn, but only in certain circumstances. Or they say we may, which sort of suggests you should be telling them. So, for instance, they may accept a peppercorn if there's a residence management company comprised of the long leaseholders, or it's a housing association local authority landlord, because local authorities tend to charge £10 on the former council flats, £10 per annum. And also they may accept a peppercorn if there's a leasehold extension by statute, because it has to be a peppercorn. Don't ask why, but that's what they're saying. If that's what they say, that's what they want. The long and the short of it is I would always tell the client about any ground rent increase, and unless the mortgage company says we don't want to know, I would tell the mortgage company. And if they say what you think, if you're happy, we are happy, I think you refer it to your valuer. Some mortgage companies, for instance, say we don't want to know about retail prices index or consumer prices index, then you don't tell them, but otherwise I'd tell them. And I'll get you on to the more recent things and then tie things up. So I need a good 50 minutes break to go to the pub. No, I'm not. But the last 3 paragraphs of page 21, go on to page 22. Just before Christmas last, Barrett's and Bellway Homes announced that for all their new leases, it has to be new ones, they won't be charging the ground rent, it'll be a peppercorn. And they would have a 999 term, and they'd have residence management companies set up, which I think is a bit of a disaster because they have to employ somebody to manage the blocks. And they tend on occasion not to produce accounts and things. But Countryside, 250-year term peppercorns. Taylor Wimpey, don't mention the term, but nothing but peppercorns for all their new leases. And helpfully, Barclay Homes say peppercorns on some and not others. As I mentioned earlier, the new Help to Buys that came in April have got to be a leasehold, has to be a peppercorn. I'll mention what happened in January. On January the 7th, the Ministry of Housing, soon to be the Ministry of Levelling Up, don't forget when you people have to pay us poor Northerners lots of money. But I couldn't believe this press release because it was just nonsense. They said, for instance, that in the future, if you want to extend your lease, currently for a house, it's 50 years under the 67 Leasehold Reform Act, and for a flat, it's 90 years. In the future, we'll be able to extend for 990 years. And they announced in May with the Queen's speech that they were going to go ahead with legislation this parliamentary year. Nothing's happened yet on this one, but they are adamant it will happen. If it's a house, you've got a right to buy the freehold after 2 years. You don't have to, like blocks of flats, cooperate with other people. Why on earth you would want a 990-year lease for your house extension when you can buy the freehold after 2 years? I really don't know. And more bizarrely than that, they also announced that the legislation will include provision that if you go through a statutory extension in the future, the new rent will be a peppercorn. I've got news. It already is and has been since 1967. It's the kind of thing, years and years back, I used to do university lecturing, many years ago now, when I was a child lecturer. And if somebody had produced that in an examination, they'd have failed that press release. But what then happened in May, they also announced, they announced a whole raft of things that they're going to quite exciting. I mean, two of them, they announced this change to the sort of extension and some enfranchisement, and also getting rid of assured short holds. Nothing's happened yet with them, but they also announced they'll go ahead with this leasehold reform ground rent bill on page 22. And that was on the Queen's speech in May. And it actually started through Parliament the following day through the House of Lords. And it's got to go through the Commons. It started its way through the House of Commons now. It's not in force, can't be that far away, but it's a small piece of legislation. It's not retrospective, but they're banning, if you've got a dwelling of more than 21 years duration, then they are banning ground rents other than peppercorns, with a few exceptions. I say it won't be retrospective. So there'll be no more ground rents apart from a token one, a nominal one that doesn't get paid. If you don't comply, the landlord can be fined up to £5,000 per breach, and the long leaseholders will be entitled to the money back. You'll be glad to know, or sorry to know, that the major exception is going to be shared ownership leases for obvious reasons, but also bringing in a bit of Islamic mortgages. Also, Islamic mortgages will be accepted, and also equity release will be accepted, because I'm sure quite a few of you appreciate, and quite a few of you probably do, Islamic mortgages, and not all, but some of them are based on a sale and lease back. You sell to the mortgage company who gives you a lease back, and you pay a rent. And similar with equity release, so they're going to be accepted. Well, I can't for the life of me remember what section of the lender's handbook. I know a lot of mortgagees have got it in their part two, like HSBC do loads of Islamic mortgages and the likes. Most solicitors I talk to don't do them. I've never had to do them myself because it's not my job. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think they're that too difficult to do. What also has happened in June the 23rd, the next paragraph down, is the Competition and Markets Authority has been leaning on some of the builders and threatening with misrepresentation and prosecutions for basically fraud, not telling the truth. And Aviva had bought a lot of these reversions of blocks of flats. They are now the landlords. They announced that they'd reached agreement with the Competition and Markets Authority that they would convert escalating ground rents free of charge. They would convert them to RPI, Retail Prices Index payments. So you will not have these doubling ground rents. I don't know what the joy of RPI is. RPI, just because it's been low recently, in recent years. I mean, if you went back to the late 80s, it was through the roof for a while. And they long term, they can be just as bad as, certainly doubling ground rents for the first 50, 60 years, until the doubling starts getting out of control. Persimmon have been, in some parts of the country, including around here in the northwest, have been creating a lot of leasehold houses, which got a lot of bad publicity for various reasons, not least of which you couldn't question the reasonableness of admin charges. I was coming across £1,000 admin charge to put a shed in your garden. Quite rare in the southeast, leasehold houses, but they stock create them anyway. If there's a leasehold house, they'll sell you the freehold at the same price as they promised that they would, because, you know, they were telling people you can buy the freehold of your leasehold house after 2 years. Why didn't you just sell them the freehold? And they were saying it's going to cost you £1,800. When 2 years comes along, it was £30,000 and £40,000. What's also happened recently, not in the notes, you might want to add it, Countryside, the builders, have now announced as well that they've reached agreement with the Competition and Markets Authority that if the ground rent doubles at less than 20-year intervals, free of charge, they will replace it with a peppercorn. There's going to be a lot of deeds of variation being done out there, if you want to get onto some little bandwagon. They are also, I know the Competition and Markets Authority is also investigating Barrett's and Taylor Wimpey, the other two very big builders, about mis-selling, not telling people the truth about ground rents and the likes. I suspect there'll be agreement reached with them. So it won't go away. It'll go away for new builds, but when this leasehold reform bill comes through, but it won't go away for existing proper builds. But I suspect there's going to be a lot of political pressure and threats put on the builders to get rid of those, certainly ground rents that double at less than 20-year intervals. So that's the good news. I've never attempted good news in a course before. The last pages, I mentioned service charges earlier, but things like removal of cladding, you've always got something about good estate management, in the interest of good estate management in your lease. So that can be almost anything. The work must be reasonably incurred if it's residential, of reasonable standard. You have to go through consultation galore, but if it's reasonable to do and you go through consultation, you can almost certainly add to service charge. And also these waking watchers, the service charge, that can get added to service charge. Modern leases, so you can charge for service of notices and the likes required by competent authorities or compliance with competent authorities. And all the fire authorities are saying until the cladding's being replaced, you've got to have these waking watchers. Well, there you go. Protect your back on leaseholds in particular. Make sure they're aware of what the service charge is and how it can fluctuate, and make sure they're aware of what the ground rent can increase, no matter what it is vis-a-vis the client. Any final questions? You've got a bit about Japanese knotweed, but I've said what I want to say. I'm going to go to the local Japanese knotweed restaurant now for lunch, and I won't have some Japanese knotweed gin until I've finished. Don't worry about that. But I wasn't kidding on that. Check out the Japanese knotweed restaurant in Brighton or Bristol. Anyway, any final questions? Well, don't forget, I was mentioned at the beginning, the afternoon, if you're here this afternoon, is a totally different course. So you need to leave this one. I'll end the meeting if there's no final questions shortly, and join up with a different link for this afternoon if you're here. And well, I never know what to say at these moments. I got the idea from EastEnders. I think those EWS1 certificates, they just really need to start afresh. And that's probably the most depressing thing, especially if you do a lot of leaseholds, which you tend to in the southeast all over the place nowadays. But I'll just mention, I got the idea from EastEnders, so I'll just say as we finish, if you've been affected by any of today's issues, here's a number to call. I'm offering counselling. It's not my number I'm going to give you. I'll decide that later. But anyway, see some of you in 50 odd minutes. Thank you.